In the eerie silence of Harrow Manor, a cryptic invitation lures Miss Jane Marple to a weekend fraught with secrets. A shattered heirloom, a body in the rose garden, and a missing will unravel a web of greed, blackmail, and betrayal. As whispers of scandal and a hidden family truth surface, Miss Marple's keen eye pierces through lies, exposing a murderer among the Manor's elite. Will her quiet wisdom untangle the deadly motives before another crime strikes? Dive into a chilling tale of deception where every glance hides a clue and no secret stays buried. Chapter 1: An Unexpected Invitation. The late afternoon sun spilled soft golden light through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cosy sitting room in St. Mary Mead. The village was quiet, as it often was, with only the distant hum of a lawn-mower and the faint chirping of sparrows breaking the stillness. Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, a worn but comfortable piece of furniture that had seen many years of her quiet observations. Her knitting needles clicked softly, shaping a pale pink scarf for her niece's birthday. The rhythm of the needles was steady, almost meditative, but her sharp blue eyes were not on the wool. They were fixed on a letter, propped against a teacup on the small table beside her. The letter had arrived that morning, delivered by the postman, Mr. Jenkins, who had lingered a moment longer than usual, perhaps hoping for a bit of gossip. Miss Marple had smiled politely, thanked him, and closed the door before opening the envelope. It was written in a fine, elegant hand, on thick cream-coloured paper that smelled faintly of lavender. The sender was Lady Beatrice Harrow, a name Miss Marple had not thought of in years. Beatrice had been a school friend, though not a close one. From those long-ago days at Miss Hartnell's Academy for Young Ladies, they had lost touch after Beatrice married Sir Reginald Harrow, a man of wealth and status, and moved to his family's estate in the countryside. Miss Marple had stayed in St. Mary Mead, content with her modest life, her garden, and her knack for noticing things others missed. The letter was an invitation, but not an ordinary one. Beatrice wrote of a weekend gathering at Harrow Manor, her home in the remote village of Ashford Vale, some 50 miles from St. Mary Mead. The words were polite, even warm, but there was something else, a hint of worry woven into the neat lines. Beatrice mentioned strange occurrences at the manor, things that troubled her peace. She did not say what these were, only that she hoped Miss Marple's wise perspective might bring clarity. The request was subtle, but Miss Marple's keen mind caught it at once. Beatrice was asking for help, though she was too proud to say so outright. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and picked up the letter again, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. She had always liked Beatrice, though they were different. In many ways, Beatrice had been bold and confident, the sort of girl who laughed easily and charmed everyone. Miss Marple had been quieter, watching from the edges, noticing the small details others overlooked, the way a girl's smile faltered, or how someone's hands fidgeted when they spoke. Those habits had served her well over the years, helping her unravel mysteries in St. Mary Mead that baffled even the police. A stolen necklace, a forged will, a whispered threat in the vicarage garden, she had solved them all. Not with grand gestures, but with patience and a deep understanding of people now. As she read Beatrice's words again, Miss Marple felt a familiar spark of curiosity. Strange occurrences, she thought. It was a vague phrase, but it suggested trouble, perhaps secrets, perhaps danger. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when Mrs. Clement's maid had spoken of odd happenings at the vicarage. It had turned out to be a matter of missing silverware and a jealous housekeeper, but the signs had been there for those who knew where to look. Miss Marple suspected Harrow Manor held something more serious, something that had shaken Beatrice enough to reach out after decades of silence. She rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed to the window. The garden outside was in full bloom, with roses nodding in the breeze and bees humming lazily. It was a peaceful scene, but Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere. Picturing Harrow Manor, she imagined a grand old house, with ivy-covered walls and tall windows, the kind of place where secrets hid in shadowed corners. Beatrice had mentioned a few guests: her son Charles, his wife Lydia, her niece Eleanor, and an estate manager named Mr. Grayson. There would be others, too, no doubt servants, perhaps a local vicar or neighbour. Each person would bring their own story, their own reasons for being there, and Miss Marple knew from experience that where people gathered, trouble often followed. She returned to her chair and sipped her tea, now cold but still comforting. The invitation was for the coming weekend, just 3 days away. She would need to arrange things. Her neighbour, Mrs. Price, could water the roses, and young Tommy could feed the birds. There was also the matter of packing. Miss Marple preferred simple clothes, but a manor house called for a bit of effort. Her black silk dress, perhaps, and the brooch her mother had given her. Nothing flashy, but enough to blend in with Beatrice's world. As she planned, her thoughts drifted to Beatrice's letter again. The phrase, strange occurrences, stuck with her, like a tune she couldn't quite place. It reminded her of a story from St. Mary Mead, when old Mr. Hargreaves had complained of queer noises in his barn. The village had whispered of ghosts, but Miss Marple had found a simpler truth: a runaway boy hiding in the hay, stealing eggs to survive. People often saw mystery where there was only human nature, she thought, but human nature could be mystery enough. She decided to accept the invitation. It wasn't just curiosity, though that played a part. Beatrice's letter had a tone of quiet desperation, and Miss Marple could not ignore a friend in need. Besides, a change of scene might do her good. St. Mary Mead was dear to her, but its small dramas, Mrs. Baxter's lost cat, or the squabble over the church fete were predictable. Harrow Manor promised something new, something that would test her ability to see what others missed. The next morning, Miss Marple wrote a reply to Beatrice, her handwriting neat and precise. She kept it brief, saying she was delighted to visit and looked forward to catching up. She didn't mention the strange occurrences. Better to observe first, she thought, than to ask questions that might put Beatrice on guard. She sealed the letter and handed it to Mr. Jenkins when he came by, ignoring his curious glance. "Off on a trip, Miss Marple?" he asked, and she smiled, giving nothing away. "Just a visit to an old friend," she said, and that was that. The days passed quickly. Miss Marple arranged for her garden and birds, packed her small suitcase, and found herself humming as she worked. There was something invigorating about a new challenge, even at her age. She wasn't young anymore, but her mind was as sharp as ever, and her eyes missed nothing. She thought of Beatrice's household: Charles, the son, who might be proud like his late father; Lydia, his wife, who could be charming or calculating; Eleanor, the niece, who might feel out of place; and Mr. Grayson, the estate manager, who likely knew more than he let on. Servants, too, would be key servants, always saw things others didn't. On Friday morning, Miss Marple boarded the train to Ashford Vale. The journey was pleasant, with fields and hedgerows flashing past the window. She knitted as she travelled, her needles clicking in time with the train's rhythm. A young woman in the carriage, travelling with a small dog, struck up a conversation, and Miss Marple listened politely, noting the woman's nervous habit of twisting her ring. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple stored it away, as she did. With all details, you never knew what might matter later. Ashford Vale Station was small, with a single platform and a ticket office that looked half asleep. A driver waited for her, a stout man named Mr. Dobbs, who tipped his cap and took her suitcase. "Harrow Manor?" Miss Fay asked, and she nodded, climbing into the back of a polished black car. The drive took them through winding lanes, past stone walls and sheep-dotted fields. The air was cool, with a hint of rain, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer. Harrow Manor came into view as they crested a hill. It was as grand as she'd imagined, a sprawling stone house with tall chimneys and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. Ivy clung to the walls, giving it an air of age and secrecy. The grounds were neat, with trimmed hedges and a gravel drive that crunched under the car's tires. But there was something else, a stillness, almost too perfect, as if the house were holding its breath. Mr. Dobbs stopped at the front steps, where a maid, young and nervous-looking, waited to greet her. "Miss Marple, I'm Annie," the girl said, bobbing a curtsy. "Lady Harrow's expecting you." Her voice was soft, but her eyes darted toward the house, as if checking for something or someone. Miss Marple smiled, noting the girl's unease. Servants, she thought, always knew more than they said. Inside. The manor was all polished wood and soft carpets, with portraits of stern-faced Harrows staring down from the walls. Annie led her to a drawing-room where Lady Beatrice Harrow rose to greet her. Beatrice was older, of course, her hair now silver and her face lined, but her eyes still held the spark Miss Marple remembered. "Jane, my dear," Beatrice said, taking her hands. "It's been too long." Her smile was warm, but there was a tightness to it, a shadow of worry. They sat, and a maid, not Annie, but an older woman with a sharp face, brought tea. Beatrice introduced her as Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, who nodded stiffly before leaving. Over tea, Beatrice spoke of small things, the weather, the roses, the village fete, but Miss Marple sensed she was avoiding the real reason for the invitation. She didn't press, though. There would be time to learn more. Beatrice introduced the others as they gathered for tea. Charles Harrow, her son, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a handsome face but a restless manner, as if he couldn't sit still. His wife Lydia was striking, with dark hair and a smile that seemed practiced. Eleanor, the niece, was quieter, with soft brown eyes that avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Mr. Grayson, the estate manager, was charming, with a quick laugh and a way of making everyone feel at ease, perhaps too much so. Miss Marple thought, as they chatted. Miss Marple watched. Charles fidgeted with his cufflinks. Lydia touched her necklace often. Eleanor clutched her teacup too tightly, and Mr. Grayson's eyes lingered on Beatrice a moment too long. Small things, but they told a story. There was tension here, unspoken, but heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Dinner was announced, and they moved to the dining room, a grand space with a long table and glittering chandelier. The food was simple but well prepared: roast lamb, potatoes, and peas from the garden. Conversation flowed, though it was strained. Charles spoke of the estate's finances, hinting at troubles. Lydia laughed too loudly at a weak joke. Eleanor said little, her eyes on her plate. Mr. Grayson told a story about a fox in the orchard, but his charm felt calculated, like a performance. Then came the crash. It was loud, echoing from somewhere deep in the house, and everyone froze. Beatrice stood, her face pale. "What was that?" she asked, her voice sharp. Mrs. Poole appeared, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's the library, ma'am," she said. "The jade statuette's fallen." They hurried to the library, Miss Marple trailing behind, her steps slow but her eyes sharp. The statuette, a delicate thing carved with dragons, lay in pieces on the floor. Beatrice gasped, her hand to her heart. "It was Reginald's," she said, "worth a fortune." Charles swore under his breath. Lydia touched her necklace again, and Eleanor stared at the shards as if they held a secret. Mr. Grayson knelt to examine the mess, but Miss Marple noticed he didn't touch it. "An accident," Beatrice said, though her voice trembled. "It must have been." But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She saw no dust on the shelf where the statuette had stood, no sign it had been loose. And there was something else, a faint mark on the floor, like a scuff from a shoe leading toward the window. As they returned to the dining room, Miss Marple's mind was already at work. A broken statuette was no great crime, but it was a sign, like the first ripple in a pond. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of a broken vase that had hidden. A thief's haste. People broke things to cover other deeds, she knew, or to send a message. And at Harrow Manor, with its grand walls and watchful eyes, she sensed a message was being sent. Beatrice apologized, her composure returning, and dinner continued, though the mood was darker. Miss Marple ate quietly, listening to the chatter, noting the glances. Charles was angry, Lydia was nervous, Eleanor was silent, and Mr. Grayson was too calm. Mrs. Poole hovered, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Annie, the young maid, cleared plates with shaking hands. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to her room, a cosy space with a four-poster bed and a view of the gardens. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and thought. The statuette was a clue, but to what? A warning, a distraction. She recalled Beatrice's letter, the mention of strange occurrences. This was one, but there would be others, she was sure, as she prepared for bed. She heard voices below Charles and Lydia, arguing in hushed tones. She couldn't catch the words, but the anger was clear. She made a note of it, as she did of everything. Then, as she turned down the lamp, she saw a shadow move across the lawn, a figure, quick and silent, heading toward the orchard. It was too dark to see who, but Miss Marple's heart quickened. Something was afoot at Harrow Manor, and she would find out what. She climbed into bed, her knitting on the bedside table, and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind was too busy, piecing together the day's details, the letter, the statuette, the scuff mark, the shadow. Harrow Manor was a puzzle, and Miss Jane Marple loved puzzles. She would watch and listen and wait. The truth, she knew, always came out in the end. Chapter 2. Arrival at Harrow Manor. The car's tires crunched on the gravel drive as Mr. Dobbs, the driver, brought it to a smooth stop before the grand front steps of Harrow Manor. Miss Jane Marple peered out the window, her sharp blue eyes taking in the sight of the house. It was even more imposing up close than it had seemed from the hill, a vast stone structure with tall, narrow windows that glinted in the late afternoon light like eyes keeping watch. Ivy crawled up the walls, giving the manor an air of age, as if it had stood there for centuries, guarding its secrets. The air was cool, with a faint dampness that hinted at rain, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She thanked Mr. Dobbs, who tipped his cap and carried her small suitcase to the steps, where a young maid waited. "I'm Annie," the maid said, her voice soft and nervous. She was a slight girl, no older than 20, with pale cheeks and eyes that darted toward the house, as if expecting something to leap out. "Lady Harrow's waiting for you," Miss Marple bobbed a curtsy, her hands twisting in her apron. Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her mind was already at work. Annie's unease was plain, and Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead that servants often sensed trouble before anyone else. A fidgety maid, she recalled, had once led her to uncover a stolen brooch hidden in a pantry. Annie's nerves were a clue, small but worth noting. The heavy oak door creaked as Annie pushed it open, revealing a grand entrance hall. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the soft glow of a chandelier above. Portraits lined the walls, stern men and women in old-fashioned clothes, their painted eyes following Miss Marple as she stepped inside. A wide staircase curved upward, its banister gleaming with fresh polish. The air smelled of beeswax and lavender, but there was something else, too, a faint mustiness, as if parts of the house were rarely opened. Miss Marple's black silk dress rustled softly as she followed Annie, her sensible shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. They passed through a corridor adorned with tapestries and vases of fresh roses, their scent mingling with the polish. Annie led her to a drawing room, where Lady Beatrice Harrow stood by a tall window, gazing out at the gardens. Beatrice turned, her silver hair catching the light, and her face broke into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jane, my dear," she said, crossing the room to take Miss Marple's hands. "It's been far too long." Her voice was warm, but there was a strain in it, a tightness that Miss Marple recognized from her letter. Beatrice was worried, though she hid it well. Beatrice was older now, her face lined with years, but she still carried herself with the grace Miss Marple remembered from their school days. Her dress was elegant, a deep green that matched the emerald brooch at her throat, but her hands trembled slightly as she gestured to a chair. "Do sit, Jane. You must be tired after your journey." Miss Marple settled into a plush armchair, her knitting bag at her side, and accepted a cup of tea from a tray brought by another servant, stern-faced woman introduced as Mrs. Poole. The housekeeper, Mrs. Poole's eyes were sharp, like a hawk's, and she moved with a brisk efficiency that suggested she missed nothing. Miss Marple noted her, too, thinking of a St. Mary Mead housekeeper who had known every secret in the vicarage. They sipped tea and talked of small things, the train journey, the weather, the roses blooming in the Manor's gardens. Beatrice's chatter was light, but Miss Marple sensed she was avoiding something. The letter had mentioned strange occurrences, yet Beatrice said nothing of them now. Miss Marple didn't press. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they felt at ease, and she was content to watch and listen. Her eyes roamed the room, taking in the details, the heavy velvet curtains, the polished mahogany table, the silver candlesticks gleaming on the mantel. Everything was perfect, yet there was a stillness, a sense that the house was waiting for something to happen. Beatrice began to speak of the weekend's plans: dinner tonight, a walk in the gardens tomorrow, perhaps a game of bridge. She mentioned the other guests, her voice careful, as if choosing her words. "My son Charles will be here, with his wife Lydia. Eleanor, my niece, is staying with us, too. And Mr. Grayson, our estate manager, will join us for meals. They're a lively group, Jane. I'm sure you'll find them interesting." Her smile flickered, and Miss Marple caught at a hint of unease, perhaps fear. Interesting, she thought, could mean many things. As if on cue, the door opened, and Charles Harrow strode in. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a handsome face, marred by a slight frown. His suit was well tailored, but his tie was slightly askew, as if he'd loosened it in a hurry. "Mother," he said, nodding to Beatrice, then turned to Miss Marple. "You must be Miss Marple, pleasure." His voice was polite, but his eyes were restless, scanning the room as if looking for something or someone. Miss Marple smiled and shook his hand, noting the strength of his grip and the faint calluses on his fingers. A man used to work, perhaps, or one who liked to seem so. Lydia followed close behind, her entrance like a breeze stirring the room. She was striking, with dark hair swept up in an elegant style and a red dress that hugged her figure. Her smile was bright, almost too bright, and her eyes lingered on Miss Marple a moment longer than necessary, as if sizing her up. "Miss Marple, how lovely to meet you," she said, her voice smooth as silk. She touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a habit Miss Marple noted at once. In St. Mary Mead, a woman who fidgeted with her jewellery often had something to hide her. Lover, a debt, a lie. Lydia's charm was polished, but Miss Marple sensed a calculation behind it. Eleanor, the niece, entered next, her steps hesitant. She was younger, perhaps 25, with soft brown hair and eyes that avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Her dress was simple, a pale blue that seemed chosen to blend in rather than stand out. "Hello," she said quietly, offering Miss Marple a shy smile. There was a fragility to her, like a bird ready to take flight, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Eleanor was out of place here, she thought, like a guest who didn't quite belong. But why? Last came Mr. Grayson, the estate manager, a man of medium height with a quick smile and eyes that sparkled with charm. His suit was less formal than Charles's, but he wore it with ease, as if comfortable in any company. "Miss Marple, a delight," he said, bowing slightly. His voice was warm, almost too warm, and Miss Marple noted how his gaze lingered on Beatrice, then flicked to Lydia, then Eleanor. A man who watched everyone, she thought, and likely knew more than he let on. They sat for tea, and the conversation flowed, though it was strained. Charles spoke of the estate, his tone clipped as he mentioned repairs needed for the stables. Lydia laughed at a story Beatrice told about a village fete, but her laughter was sharp, cutting off too soon. Eleanor said little, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Mr. Grayson filled the silences with easy chatter about the orchards, apples, and the beauty of Ashford Vale. Miss Marple listened, her teacup warm in her hands, her eyes moving from one face to another. She saw small things, Charles's fingers tapping the arm of his chair, Lydia's quick glance at her husband, Eleanor's sudden stillness when Grayson mentioned the orchard, Beatrice's hand tightening on her cup. Small things, but they told a story. Mrs. Poole returned to clear the tea tray, her movements brisk but silent. Miss Marple caught her eye and smiled, but the housekeeper's face remained stern, almost suspicious. Annie, the young maid, lingered in the doorway, her hands still twisting in her apron. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later. Servants, she knew, were often the key to a house's secrets. Beatrice suggested a tour of the manor, and Miss Marple agreed, eager to see more. They walked through the ground floor, passing a dining room with a long table set for dinner, a library filled with leather-bound books, and a conservatory where orchids bloomed in delicate shades of pink and white. The manor was beautiful, but there was a weight to it, a sense of secrets hidden in the polished wood and shadowed corners. Miss Marple noticed details: a scuff on the library floor, a curtain. Slightly askew in the conservatory, a faint smell of smoke in the hall. She said nothing, but stored each observation away, like pieces of a puzzle. They paused in the library, where Beatrice pointed out a jade statuette on a high shelf, its dragon carvings gleaming in the light. "Reginald's favourite," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He brought it back from China years ago." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes were on the shelf, noting its height and the lack of dust around the statuette. Someone had touched it recently, she thought, and not just to clean. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple felt the tension again, heavier now. Charles excused himself, muttering about estate papers, and Lydia followed, her smile tight. Eleanor lingered, her fingers tracing the edge of a table, and Mr. Grayson offered to show Miss Marple the gardens, but she declined, saying she preferred to rest before dinner. Beatrice walked her to her room, her chatter light but her eyes worried. "I'm so glad you're here, Jane," she said, squeezing her hand. "It's comforting." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. Comforting, she thought. An odd word, unless Beatrice felt unsafe. Her room was on the second floor, a cozy space with a four-poster bed, a small fireplace, and a window overlooking the gardens. The bed was made with crisp linens, and a vase of roses sat on the dresser, their scent filling the air. Miss Marple unpacked her suitcase, hanging her black silk dress in the wardrobe and setting her knitting bag on a chair. She sat by the window, her needles clicking softly as she worked on the pink scarf, but her eyes were on the grounds below. The gardens were neat, with roses and hedges in perfect rows. But there was a wildness to the orchard beyond, where trees twisted in the fading light. She thought of Beatrice's letter, the strange occurrences that had brought her here. The broken statuette from her imagined version of the story hadn't happened yet, but she felt it coming, like a storm on the horizon. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, when a broken window had been the first sign of a burglary. Things broke. For a reason, she knew, carelessness, anger, or to hide something worse. Harrow Manor felt like a place where things might break, and soon dinner was announced at 7, and Miss Marple changed into her black silk dress, pinning her mother's brooch to the collar. She descended the staircase, her steps slow but steady, and joined the others in the dining room. The table was set with silver and crystal, the chandelier casting a warm glow. Beatrice sat at the head, with Charles and Lydia to her right, Eleanor to her left, and Mr. Grayson across from Miss Marple. Mrs. Poole supervised as Annie and another maid served the meal roast lamb, potatoes, and peas, simple but delicious. The conversation was polite but forced. Charles spoke of the estate's finances, his tone sharp as he mentioned rising costs. Lydia laughed at a story Grayson told about a village fair, but her eyes were on her husband, watchful. Eleanor ate quietly, her fork trembling slightly. Grayson was charming, drawing Beatrice into a discussion about the gardens. But Miss Marple noticed how his gaze flicked to each person, as if measuring them. She ate slowly, listening, watching, storing every detail. Then it happened. A loud crash echoed through the house, sharp and startling. Everyone froze, forks halfway to mouths. Beatrice stood, her face pale. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Poole appeared in the doorway, her hands clenched. "The library, ma'am," she said. "The jade statuette, it's smashed." They hurried to the library, Miss Marple trailing behind, her eyes sharp. The statuette lay in pieces on the floor, its dragon carvings shattered. Beatrice gasped, her hand to her heart. "Reginald's," she whispered, It was priceless. Charles swore, his face red. Lydia touched her necklace, her fingers shaking. Eleanor stared at the shards, her eyes wide. Grayson knelt to look, but his hands stayed at his sides. An accident, Beatrice said, though her voice wavered. It must have been, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She saw the clean shelf, the scuff mark on the floor, the curtains slightly open at the window. Someone had been here, she thought, and not by chance. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a broken vase had hidden. A thief's haste. This was no accident, she was sure. They returned to the dining room, the mood darker now. Beatrice tried to lighten it, speaking of the weather, but no one listened. Charles drank his wine too quickly. Lydia's smile was gone. Eleanor's hands were hidden in her lap, and Grayson's charm felt forced. Miss Marple ate quietly, her mind working. The statuette was a sign, she thought, a warning or a distraction, but of what? After dinner, she retired to her room, her knitting in her hands. She sat by the window, the manor quiet now, but the silence felt heavy, like a held breath. She thought of the people she'd met: Charles, restless and angry; Lydia, charming but nervous; Eleanor, quiet and scared; Grayson, too smooth; Mrs. Poole bid Annie, trembling. Each had a story, she knew, and one of them was hiding something as she knitted. She saw a shadow move across the lawn, quick and silent, heading toward the orchard. It was too dark to see who, but her heart quickened. She thought of Beatrice's letter, the broken statuette, the scuff mark. Harrow Manor was a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to solve it. She set her knitting aside and prepared for bed, but her mind didn't rest. The pieces were there, waiting to be put together, and she would find them, one by one. Chapter 3. The first disturbance. The dining room at Harrow Manor was silent, save for the faint clink of silver against china as the household resumed their meal after the startling crash in the library. The shattered jade statuette, a priceless heirloom from Sir Reginald Harrow's travels, lay in pieces in Miss Jane Marple's mind as clearly as if it was still before her. She sat at the long mahogany table, her fork poised over a slice of roast lamb, but her sharp blue eyes were not on her plate. They moved from face to face, noting the strained expressions of Lady Beatrice Harrow and her guests. The air was thick with unease, like a fog that clung to the room's polished surfaces, and Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead that such a fog often hid secrets. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, tried to restore calm. "It's just a statuette," she said, her voice light but trembling at the edges. "Accidents happen, don't they?" She smiled, but her hands gripped her napkin too tightly, crumpling the fine linen. Miss Marple nodded politely, sipping her water, but her mind was elsewhere. Accidents, she thought, were rarely just accidents. In St. Mary Mead, a broken teapot had once revealed a servant's theft, the shards hiding a hurried attempt to cover a crime. The jade statuette, with its dragon carvings now scattered across the library floor, felt like a signaler crack in the manor's polished surface, hinting at something darker beneath. Charles Harrow, Beatrice's son, sat to her right, his broad shoulders hunched as he stabbed at his potatoes. His face was red, his jaw tight, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers clenched his fork, as if he were holding back a storm. "Priceless, you said," he muttered, glancing at his mother. "Father's favourite, and now it's gone, just like that." His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of anger in his eyes, not just at the loss, but at something deeper. She recalled a St. Mary Mead farmer, Mr. Hodge, whose temper had flared over a broken fence, only for her to learn it was his fear of ruin that fueled his rage. Charles, she thought, might be hiding a similar fear. Lydia, Charles's wife, sat beside him, her dark hair gleaming under the chandelier's glow. She laughed, a quick, nervous sound that cut through the silence. "Oh, Charles, it's just a thing. We have plenty of treasures here." Her hand touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a gesture Miss Marple had noticed earlier. It was a habit, like Mrs. Baxter in St. Mary Mead, who twisted her bracelet when lying about her husband's debts. Lydia's smile was bright, but her eyes darted to Charles, then away, as if afraid of what she might see. Miss Marple stored this away, a small piece of the puzzle. Eleanor, Beatrice's niece, sat across from Miss Marple, her soft brown hair falling over her face as she stared at her plate. She had said nothing since the library, her hands hidden in her lap, her shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her fork trembled when she lifted it. Eleanor was frightened, she thought, but of what? In St. Mary Mead? A shy girl like Eleanor had once been terrified of a secret lover's threats. Was Eleanor hiding something similar, or was it the manor itself that scared her? Mr. Grayson, the estate manager, leaned back in his chair, his charming smile still in place despite the tension. "It's a shame about the statuette," he said, his voice smooth. "But perhaps it was unsteady on that shelf. Old houses, you know things shift." He sipped his wine, his eyes flicking to Beatrice, then to Charles, then to Eleanor. Miss Marple noticed his calm, to perfect, like a mask. In St. Mary Mead, a charming newcomer had once used such ease to hide a scheme to swindle the vicar. Grayson's charm, she thought, was worth watching. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, hovered near the door, her sharp eyes scanning the room as Annie, the nervous maid, cleared plates. Miss Marple caught Mrs. Poole's glance, stern and unyielding, and made a mental note. Housekeepers, she knew, saw everything, every late-night visitor, every whispered argument. Mrs. Poole's silence was as telling as Annie's trembling hands. Servants, Miss Marple thought, were often the key to a house's secrets, and she would find a way to speak with them both. The meal continued, but the conversation was stilted. Beatrice spoke of the gardens, her voice forced, as if trying to erase the memory of the shattered statuette. Charles grunted responses, Lydia laughed too loudly, Eleanor stayed silent, and Grayson filled the gaps with stories of the village. Miss Marple listened, her knitting bag at her feet, her mind piecing together the scene. The statuette's fall was no accident, she was sure. The shelf had been clean, with no dust to suggest a slip, and the scuff mark on the library floor, a faint smear of dirt, hinted at someone's presence. She thought of the open curtain, the shadow she'd seen in the orchard last night. Someone had been in the library, and they'd wanted the statuette broken. But why? As dessert was served a simple apple tart, Miss Marple steered the conversation, gently asking about the manor's history. "Such a lovely house," she said, her voice mild. "It must hold many stories." Beatrice brightened, eager for a safer topic. "Oh yes," she said. "The Harrows have lived here for generations. Reginald loved this place, his study, the library, the orchard. He brought that statuette back from China, you know. It meant so much to him." Her voice caught, and Miss Marple saw Charles stiffen, his eyes narrowing. "Father's treasures," Charles said, his tone bitter, "always more important than the estate's debts." Lydia shot him a look, her hand at her necklace again, and Miss Marple noted the exchange. Debts, she thought. In St. Mary Mead, debts had driven a man to forge a will. Could Charles's anger be tied to money troubles? She filed it away, another piece of the puzzle. Eleanor spoke then, her voice so soft it was almost lost. The statuette was beautiful, she said. I used to stare at it as a child. Her eyes met Miss Marple's for a moment, then dropped. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly, but Eleanor said no more. There was something there, she thought, a memory, perhaps a secret. Grayson leaned forward, his smile warm. It was a fine piece, he said, but the Manor has others. We'll manage without it. His tone was light, but Miss Marple caught a flicker in his eyes, a calculation that made her wary. After dinner, the group moved to the drawing room for coffee. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace, her knitting in her lap, the needles clicking softly as she worked on her pink scarf. The room was warm, the fire casting shadows on the walls, but the tension lingered so nigh. Beatrice sat beside her, speaking of the village, but her eyes were distant. Charles paced by the window, his hands in his pockets. Lydia perched on a sofa, her fingers at her necklace. Eleanor sat alone, staring at the fire. Grayson stood by the mantel, his charm undimmed as he chatted with Beatrice. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind busy. The statuette's fall was a message, she thought, a warning, a distraction, or a cover for something else. She recalled the scuff mark, the dirt that didn't match the library's polished floor. It was red clay, she realized, like the soil in the Manor's orchard. Someone had been outside, then entered the library, but who and why break the statuette? She excused herself early, saying she was tired, and returned to her room. The Manor was quiet now, the halls dark and still. She sat by the window, her knitting in her hands, and thought of the day's events. The broken statuette, Charles's anger, Lydia's nervousness, Eleanor's fear, Grayson's calm, the servant's unease. Each was a clue, small but vital. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of a broken window that had led to a thief. Harrow Manor's secrets were bigger, she knew, and the statuette was just the beginning as she prepared for bed. She heard voices below Charles and Lydia arguing in hushed tones. She couldn't hear the words, but the anger was clear. Then a creak in the hall, soft but deliberate. She opened her door, a crack, peering out. A figure moved toward the staircase Eleanor, her face pale in the moonlight. She was heading outside. Toward the orchard, Miss Marple closed her door, her heart quickening. The puzzle was growing, piece by piece, and she would watch and listen and wait. The truth, she knew, was there, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 4. Whispers in the night. The moonlight spilled through the tall windows of Miss Jane Marple's guest room at Harrow Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floorboards. The four-poster bed, with its crisp linens and heavy curtains, stood ready, but Miss Marple was not yet asleep. She sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, the pink scarf growing longer with each careful stitch. Her sharp blue eyes, however, were fixed on the gardens below, where the orchard's twisted trees stood like silent sentinels in the dark. The house was quiet, or so it seemed, but Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead that silence often hid the loudest secrets. The broken jade statuette from the library lingered in her mind, its shattered dragon carvings, a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. The scuff mark on the floor red clay, she was certain. From the orchard suggested someone had been outside before the incident. The open curtain, the clean shelf, the nervous glances at dinner all were pieces of a larger picture, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, where a broken teacup had led her to a servant's betrayal. The statuette, she suspected, was no accident but a deliberate act. Perhaps a warning or a cover for something worse. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound low voices, sharp with anger, drifting up from the terrace below her window. She set her knitting aside and leaned closer, careful not to disturb the curtain. The voices belonged to Charles Harrow and his wife, Lydia. They stood just beyond the glow of the Manor's lanterns, their figures half hidden in the shadows. Miss Marple strained to hear, her ears as sharp as her eyes. "You can't keep ignoring it." "Charles," Lydia said, her voice low but fierce, "the debts are piling up. If we don't act soon, we'll lose everything." Her hands were at her throat, clutching her pearl necklace, a habit Miss Marple had noted earlier. In St. Mary Mead, such gestures often betrayed worry, and Lydia's worry seemed deep. Charles's reply was a growl. "Don't you think I know that? I'm doing all I can. Grayson's been no help, poking into things that aren't his business." He paced, his boots scuffing the stone terrace. "And now that blasted statuette mother's acting like it's the end of the world." "It's just a thing, Charles," Lydia snapped, but her voice trembled. "There are worse problems. You know what I mean." She stepped closer, her hand on his arm, but he shook it off, turning away. Miss Marple caught the word debts again, and her mind raced. Debts, she thought, were a powerful motive. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer's debts had led to a stolen will, and she wondered if Harrow Manor held a similar secret. The argument faded as Charles and Lydia moved back inside, their voices swallowed by the heavy walls. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched, her mind turning over what she'd heard. Charles was angry, Lydia was scared, and both mentioned Mr. Grayson, the estate manager, with a tone that suggested distrust. She recalled Grayson's charming smile at dinner, his easy way of filling silences, but also the way his eyes watched everyone: Beatrice, Charles, Eleanor, even her. A man who knew too much, she thought, or wanted to. She rose, her black silk dress rustling softly, and crossed to the door. The hall was dark, the manor's silence broken only by the faint creak of old wood settling. She opened her door a crack, peering out, her senses alert. Harrow Manor was a maze of corridors and shadows, and she felt the weight of its secrets pressing down. She thought of Beatrice's letter, the strange occurrences that had brought her here. The statuette was one, but there would be others. She was sure. A faint sound caught her ear, a soft thud, like a door closing, followed by footsteps, light and quick. She waited, her breath steady, and saw a figure move past the staircase at the end of the hall. It was Eleanor, Beatrice's niece, her pale blue dress catching the moonlight. She moved with purpose, her head down, heading toward the back of the house. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Eleanor, so quiet and frightened at dinner, was sneaking out, just as she had the night before. Toward the orchard. Miss Marple closed her door and returned to the window, watching as Eleanor's slim figure crossed the lawn, disappearing into the orchard's shadows. She recalled the red clay on the library floor, the same soil she'd seen in the orchard's paths. Was Eleanor connected to the statuette's fall? In St. Mary Mead, a shy girl had once slipped out at night to meet a lover, only to be caught in a scandal. Eleanor's secrecy suggested something similar or something darker. She was about to turn away when another movement caught her eye. A shadow moved near the orchard's edge, too tall to be Eleanor. It was a man, she thought, his outline indistinct but deliberate, heading toward the same trees. She couldn't see his face, but his stride was familiar. Grayson, perhaps, or Charles. The darkness hid the truth, but Miss Marple made a note of it. To people in the orchard, she thought, and neither wanting to be seen, she sat again, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm, but her mind was far from the scarf. The manor was alive with secrets, each person carrying their own. Charles and Lydia's argument about debts pointed to financial strain, perhaps desperate enough to drive them to drastic acts. Eleanor's nighttime wanderings suggested a hidden purpose, maybe fear or guilt. Grayson's name in their conversation hinted at his role in the manor's troubles, and Beatrice, with her strained smiles and talk of accidents, was hiding. Her own worries, Miss Marple thought of the library, again the clean shelf, the scuff mark, the open curtain. She pictured the statuette, its jade dragons shattered on the floor. It was no accident, she was certain. Someone had pushed it, perhaps to distract from another act, or to send a message. But to whom? Beatrice, who cherished it. Charles, who resented his father's treasures. Or someone else entirely. She rose and moved to her suitcase, pulling out a small notebook she kept for such occasions. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned to jot down details, names, times, odd behaviors. She wrote, Charles angry debts, distrusts Grayson. Lydia nervous, necklace habit, worried about money. Eleanor sneaking to orchard, frightened. Grayson charming, watchful, mentioned in argument. Beatrice hiding, worry, calls statuette. Accident, red clay orchard soil, library floor. Shadow man, orchard, same time as Eleanor. She closed the notebook, satisfied. The pieces were small, but they would grow. The night grew colder, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer, her eyes returning to the window. The orchard was dark now, no sign of Eleanor or the shadow. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of a night when she'd watched a thief slip through a garden, his shadow betraying him. Shadows, she knew, were as telling as words, if you knew how to read them. She prepared for bed, her movements slow but deliberate, her mind still turning. The manor's silence was deceptive, she thought. Beneath it lay whispers, arguments, footsteps, secrets. She recalled Beatrice's letter, the plea for her wise perspective. Beatrice knew something was wrong, but she hadn't said what. Miss Marple suspected it was more than a broken statuette. Money, fear, hidden truths, these were the currents running through Harrow Manor, and she would follow them as she climbed into bed. She heard another sound, a faint rustle, like paper sliding under a door. She rose, her heart steady, and crossed to the door. A small folded note lay on the floor, its edges rough, as if torn in haste. She picked it up, her fingers careful, and unfolded it. The writing was hurried, in black ink. Be careful, Miss Marple. Not everything is what it seems. No signature, no clue to its sender, but the words sent a chill through her. In St. Mary Mead, an anonymous note had led to a blackmailer's downfall. This note, she thought, was a warning or a threat. She tucked it into her notebook, her mind racing. Who had written it? Annie, the nervous maid, who saw too much. Mrs. Poole, the sharp-eyed housekeeper, guarding the manor's secrets. Or someone else, Eleanor perhaps, or even Grayson. The note confirmed what she already sensed. Harrow Manor was a place of danger, and she was closer to its heart than she'd realized. She returned to bed, the note's words echoing in her mind. Sleep came slowly, her thoughts filled with the manors, shadows, the broken statuette, the red clay, the orchard, the whispers. Tomorrow she would watch closer, listen sharper. The puzzle was growing, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to solve it, piece by careful piece. Chapter 5. A body in the rose garden. The morning sun rose over Harrow Manor, casting a soft golden glow across the gardens, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled in Miss Jane Marple's heart. She sat in her guest room, her knitting needles idle in her lap, the pink scarf untouched since the previous night's unsettling events. The anonymous note, "Be careful, Miss Marple. Not everything is what it seems," lay tucked in her notebook, its words echoing in her mind. She had slept little, her thoughts tangled with the broken jade statuette, the red clay on the library floor, Charles and Lydia's whispered argument about debts, Eleanor's secretive trip to the orchard, and the shadow of a man following her. Harrow Manor was a house of secrets, and Miss Marple knew from her St. Mary Mead days that secrets often led to troubles, sometimes deadly trouble. She rose, her black silk dress neatly pressed, and pinned her mother's brooch to her collar, a small ritual that steadied her. The manor was quiet as she stepped into the hall, the air heavy with the scent of polish and roses. She had planned to join Lady Beatrice Harrow for breakfast, hoping to learn more about the strange occurrences mentioned in Beatrice's letter. But as she reached the staircase, a piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing from the gardens below. Miss Marple's heart quickened, her hand gripping the banister. She knew that sound from St. Mary Mead, a cry of horror, the kind that followed a terrible discovery. She moved swiftly for her age, descending the stairs with care but purpose. The scream had come from the rose garden, she was sure, and as she reached the entrance hall, she saw Annie, the nervous young maid, running in from the terrace, her face pale as milk. "Miss, oh miss," Annie gasped, her hands trembling. "It's Mr. Grayson, he's dead." Her voice broke, and she clutched her apron, tears welling in her eyes. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Anna's arm, her voice calm. "Where, Annie? Show me." The maid nodded, leading her through the French doors to the terrace, where the rose garden spread out in neat rows of red and white blooms. The air was sweet with their scent, but a darker note hung beneath it, a metallic tang that Miss Marple recognized at once. She had smelled it before, in St. Mary Mead, when a poacher's body was found in a ditch. They reached a small clearing among the roses, where Mrs. Poole, the stern housekeeper, stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. At her feet lay Mr. Grayson, the estate manager, his charming smile gone, his face pale and still. He was sprawled on his back, his suit stained dark with blood. A letter opener, its handle carved with a dragon like the shattered statuette, protruded from his chest. The ground around him was undisturbed, the grass and roses pristine. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint smudge of red clay on his polished shoes clay from the orchard. Just like the mark in the library, she knelt, careful not to touch anything, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a murder in a garden had been solved by a single footprint, and she knew details mattered. The letter opener was no accident, it was deliberate, chosen to echo the statuette's dragons. The lack of footprints suggested the killer had been careful, perhaps luring Grayson here, and the clair-red, distinct linked this to the library incident. She stood, her face composed, as Beatrice and the others arrived, drawn by Annie's scream. Beatrice gasped, her hand at her emerald brooch. "Oh heavens, Grayson." Her voice trembled, and she swayed, Charles catching her arm. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on the body. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice rough. Lydia, beside him, clutched her pearl necklace, her lips pale. "Who would do this?" she whispered, but her eyes darted to Charles, then away. Eleanor stood at the edge, her soft brown hair hiding her face, her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles were white. Miss Marple watched them all, noting their shock, their fear, their secrets. Mrs. Poole recovered her composure, her sharp eyes narrowing. "I found him just now, ma'am," she said to Beatrice. "I was checking the roses, and there he was." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or knowledge. Annie sobbed quietly, and Miss Marple patted her shoulder, thinking of a St. Mary Mead maid who had cried over a stolen ring, only to confess later. Servants, she knew, saw more than they said. Beatrice sent Annie to call the police, and soon the sound of a car crunching on the gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock. A familiar face from Miss Marple's past cases. He was a solid man, with a kind face but a sharp mind, and he greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but wary. "I should have known you'd be here when trouble strikes." She smiled faintly, knowing he valued her insights, though he'd never admit it outright. Craddock surveyed the scene, his notebook out, his questions brisk. "Who found the body?" he asked, and Mrs. Poole stepped forward, repeating her story. He examined Grayson's body, noting the letter opener and the lack of footprints. "No struggle, it seems," he said. He knew the killer likely let them get close. Miss Marple nodded to herself, agreeing. In St. Mary Mead, a murder without a fight had pointed to a trusted friend. Craddock questioned the household, starting with Beatrice. "When did you last see Mr. Grayson?" he asked. Beatrice, pale but composed, said, "At dinner last night. He was his usual self, charming, talkative." Her voice caught, and Miss Marple noted her grief. Was it for Grayson or something else? Charles said he'd been in his study after dinner, working on estate accounts. Lydia claimed she'd gone to bed early, tired from the day. Eleanor whispered she'd been reading in her room. Each alibi was vague, Miss Marple thought, and none felt quite true. She watched Craddock's men search the garden, their boots careful on the grass. One found a small object near a rosebush silver cigarette case, engraved with Grayson's initials. He smoked, Charles said quickly. Must have dropped it. But Miss Marple noticed the case was clean, no dirt or dew, as if placed. Recently, another clue, she thought, like the red clay on Grayson's shoes. She slipped away to the library, wanting to compare the scenes. The statuette's shards were gone, swept up by Mrs. Poole, but the scuff mark of red clay remained, faint, but clear. She pictured Grayson here, then in the garden, the clay linking both places. Had he been lured from the library to the orchard, then to the roses? She recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a trail of mud had led to a killer's doorstep. Back in the drawing room, the household gathered, their faces drawn. Beatrice sat by the fire, her hands trembling. Charles paced, his anger barely contained. Lydia twisted her necklace, her eyes avoiding everyone. Eleanor stared at the floor, her silence heavy. Craddock joined them, his questions relentless. "Anyone hear anything last night?" he asked. No one spoke, but Miss Marple remembered the voices Charles and Lydia arguing. Eleanor's footsteps, the shadow in the orchard. She said nothing, letting Craddock work. But her mind was busy. She thought of the note in her room, the warning to be careful. Was it about Grayson's death, or something yet to come? In St. Mary Mead, a note had unmasked a blackmailer, and she wondered if Grayson had known too much. His charm, his watchful eyes, had he been prying into the Manor's secrets? Charles's debts, perhaps, or Eleanor's nighttime wanderings. As Craddock continued, Miss Marple slipped into the hall, where Annie was dusting a vase, her hands shaking. "Annie," Miss Marple said gently, "did you see Mr. Grayson last night?" The maid flinched, her eyes wide. "No, miss," she said, too quickly. "I was in the kitchen, then bed." Miss Marple smiled, noting the lie. Servants, she thought, always knew more. She returned to her room, her notebook open, and added, "Grayson's to bed. Letter opener, rose garden. Red clay on shoes orchard link. Cigarette cased clean, placed Beatrice grieving, hiding something. Charles angry, vague alibi. Lydia nervous, necklace habit. Eleanor silent, scared. Mrs. Poole more any lying, note warning, or threat." The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple knew the truth was close, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 6. The suspects emerged. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Harrow Manor's drawing room, casting pale stripes across the polished floor, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill that gripped the household. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pink scarf growing steadily in her lap. Her sharp blue eyes, however, were not on the wall but on the faces around her Lady Beatrice Harrow. Charles, Lydia, Eleanor, and the servants, all gathered under the watchful gaze of Inspector Craddock. The murder of Mr. Grayson, found stabbed in the rose garden with a dragon-carved letter opener, had shattered the Manor's fragile calm, and Miss Marple knew from her St. Mary Mead days that a murder brought secrets into the open, like cracks in a frozen pond. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his face serious but kind. He was a man Miss Marple respected, having worked with him on cases in St. Mary Mead, where his thoroughness paired well with her quiet insights. Now he addressed the room, his voice steady. "Mr. Grayson was killed last night, likely between 10 and midnight. The letter opener suggests someone close, someone he trusted. I need to know where each of you was during that time." His eyes scanned the group, and Miss Marple noted the flickers of unease. Charles's clenched jaw, Lydia's fingers at her pearl necklace, Eleanor's downcast eyes, Beatrice's trembling hands. Beatrice spoke first, her voice soft but firm. "I was in the conservatory after dinner, tending to my orchids. I often stay there, let it's peaceful." She smoothed her green dress, her emerald brooch glinting, but Miss Marple saw her hands shake slightly. In St. Mary Mead, a woman's calm words had hidden a lie about a stolen ring, and Beatrice's composure felt forced, as if she were guarding a secret. Craddock nodded, jotting in his notebook. "Anyone see you there, Lady Harrow?" Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flickering to Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, who stood by the door. "Mrs. Poole brought me tea round 9, she said. Mrs. Poole nodded, her sharp eyes unreadable. "That's right, sir," she said, her voice flat. Miss Marple made a mental note. Mrs. Poole's confirmation was quick, almost too quick, like a St. Mary Mead servant who'd rehearsed a story. Charles went next, his voice gruff. "I was in my study, working on estate accounts. Been at it. Most nights things are a mess." He ran a hand through his dark hair, his tie still askew from the night before. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Alone?" Charles nodded, his jaw tightening. "All night," Craddock pressed. Charles hesitated, then said, "Yes, till midnight, maybe later." Miss Marple caught the pause, the slight shift in his eyes. In St. Mary Mead, a man's hesitation had betrayed a hidden meeting, and Charles's alibi felt thin, like a thread ready to snap. Lydia spoke up, her voice bright but strained. I was in bed by 9:30, exhausted. These big dinners tire me out. She laughed, a sharp sound, her hand at her necklace again. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her eyes darted to Charles, then away. In St. Mary Mead, a woman's nervous laugh had led to a confession of theft, and Lydia's charm seemed a mask, hiding fear or guilt. Eleanor, the niece, was last, her voice barely above a whisper. I was reading in my room. I don't sleep well, so I read late. Her soft brown hair fell over her face, hiding her eyes, and her hands were clenched in her lap. Craddock leaned forward. Did you hear anything? Voices, footsteps. Eleanor shook her head, too quickly, Miss Marple thought. No, nothing, she said, her voice trembling. Miss Marple recalled Eleanor's nighttime trip to the orchard. The shadow of a man following her. Eleanor was hiding something, she was sure, just as a shy St. Mary Mead girl had hidden a lover's secret. Craddock turned to the servants. Mrs. Poole said she'd been in the kitchen, overseeing the cleaning, then retired to her room by 10. Annie, the young maid, stammered that she'd been helping in the kitchen, then went to bed. Her hands twisted in her apron, and Miss Marple noted her fear, like a St. Mary Mead maid who'd seen a crime but feared to speak. Craddock wrote it all down, his face unreadable, but Miss Marple knew he sensed the gaps in their stories, just as she did. The inspector excused the household, asking them to stay in the manor while his men searched the grounds. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her knitting a quiet rhythm, her eyes on Beatrice, who lingered by the window. Such a terrible thing, Beatrice murmured, her hands clasping her brooch. Grayson was so helpful, so kind. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw genuine grief, but also something else, fear, perhaps, of what the murder revealed. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and joined Beatrice. He seemed a charming man, she said gently, her tone inviting confidence. Beatrice nodded, her eyes distant. He managed the estate so well, but there were tensions. Charles didn't always agree with him. She stopped, as if she'd said too much, and Miss Marple smiled, not pressing. In St. Mary Mead, a woman's hesitation had led to a clue about a forged cheque, and Beatrice's words hinted at trouble between Charles and Grayson. As Beatrice left to rest, Miss Marple wandered to the terrace, her eyes on the rose garden where Grayson's body had been found. The police had cordoned it off, but she could still see the spot, the roses bright against the memory of blood. The red clay on Grayson's shoes nagged at her, linking the garden to the library's scuff mark and the orchard. She pictured Grayson, walking there, perhaps meeting someone, unaware of the danger. In St. Mary Mead, a trail of mud had led to a killer, and she wondered if the clay would do the same. She returned to the library, wanting to revisit the scene of the statuette's fall. The shards were gone, but the shelf was still clean, the scuff mark of red clay faint but clear. She knelt, her fingers tracing the floor, and found another clue, a tiny scrap of paper caught in a crack. It was torn, with only a few words visible. Pay or I'll tell. Blackmail, she thought, her heart quickening. In St. Mary Mead, a similar note had unmasked a schemer, and this scrap suggested Grayson had been pressing some, perhaps with his debts, or Eleanor with her secrets. She tucked the paper into her notebook, beside the anonymous warning she'd received. Be careful, Miss Marple. Not everything is what it seems. The two notes felt connected, she thought, like pieces of the same puzzle. Had Grayson been blackmailing someone, and had that someone silenced him? She recalled Charles and Lydia's argument about debts, Grayson's name mentioned with anger, Eleanor's fear, her orchard trips, suggested she, too, might have been a target, and Beatrice, did she know more than she let on? Miss Marple joined the household for lunch, a tense affair in the dining room. Charles barely ate, his eyes on his plate. Lydia chattered about the weather, her voice too bright. Eleanor was silent, her hands trembling. Beatrice tried to keep the conversation light, but her smiles were strained. Miss Marple watched, her mind cataloguing their behaviours, like a St. Mary Mead tea party, where every glance hid a motive. After lunch, she slipped into the hall, where Annie was polishing a mirror. "Annie," Miss Marple said softly, "did Mr. Grayson seem worried lately?" Annie flinched, her cloth pausing. I don't know, miss. He was always smiling." Her eyes darted away, and Miss Marple knew she was lying, just as she had about last night. She didn't press, but made a note. Annie knew something, perhaps about Grayson's late-night habits. As evening fell, Craddock returned, his face grim. "We found a letter in Grayson's room," he said, addressing the household. "It mentions a meeting in the orchard last night. Anyone know about that?" No one spoke, but Miss Marple saw Eleanor's hands tighten, Lydia's necklace twist, Charles's jaw clench. The letter, she thought, was another clue, tying Grayson to the orchard, to the red clay, to the murder. She retired to her room, her notebook open, and added, "Grayson blackmail note, orchard meeting. Charles weak, alibi, debts, angry at Grayson. Lydia nervous, hiding something. Eleanor, orchard, trips, scared. Beatrice, grieving, secretive, annaling. Letter meeting planned." The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 7. The missing Wilther morning air in Harrow Manor was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden where Mr. Grayson's body had been found the day before. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking. Softly, the pink scarf in her lap, a quiet contrast to the storm brewing in her mind. The murder of the estate manager, stabbed with a dragon-carved letter opener, had shaken the household, and Inspector Craddock's questions had left everyone on edge. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes moved over the room, noting the strained faces of Lady Beatrice, Harrow, Charles, Lydia, and Eleanor, each hiding something behind their polite masks. The anonymous note in her notebook, "Be careful, Miss Marple. Not everything is what it seems," weighed heavily, as did the scrap of paper from the library with its hint of blackmail. "Pay or I'll tell." In St. Mary Mead, such clues had led to unravelling dark secrets, and she knew Harrow Manor held its own. The household gathered for breakfast, but the mood was sombre, the clink of china and silver loud in the silence. Beatrice, at the head of the table, sipped her tea, her emerald brooch glinting but her hands unsteady. Charles, his tie still askew, pushed his eggs round his plate, his jaw tight. Lydia, in a blue dress that matched her forced smile, touched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting to her husband. Eleanor, pale and silent, stared at her toast, her soft brown hair hiding her face. Miss Marple ate quietly, her thoughts on the clues, the red clay on Grayson's shoes, linking the rose garden to the orchard and the library's scuff mark, the cigarette case, too clean to have been dropped, the letter mentioning an orchard, meeting, and a blackmail note suggesting Grayson knew something dangerous. Inspector Craddock had left to follow leads in the village, promising to return by noon, and Miss Marple seized the quiet moment to speak with Beatrice. She found her in the conservatory, tending to her orchids, the glass walls letting in soft light that made the flowers glow. "Jane," Beatrice said, her voice warm but tired, "you always did love gardens." She clipped a wilted leaf, her hands trembling, and Miss Marple saw the strain in her eyes, like a St. Mary Mead widow hiding a family scandal. "I do," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "But I also see things. Beatrice, you wrote of strange occurrences, and now Mr. Grayson is dead. Is there something you haven't told me?" She kept her voice kind, inviting confidence, as she had with a nervous St. Mary Mead shopgirl who'd confessed to theft. Beatrice hesitated, her scissors pausing. "It's difficult," she said at last, her voice low. "Grayson was more than our manager. He was handling my will, revising it. I wanted to make changes, to be fair to everyone." Her eyes flickered to the door, as if checking for listeners. "But the will, it's gone. It was in the safe, in Reginald's study, and now it's missing." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. A missing will, she thought, was a motive for murder. In St. Mary Mead, a lost will had led to a desperate act, and she wondered who in Harrow Manor stood to gain or lose from its disappearance. Who knew about the changes? She asked, her voice soft. Beatrice looked away, her hands clutching the scissors. "Charles, of course, he expects to inherit the estate. Lydia, too, since she's his wife. Eleanor, I told her recently. And Grayson, naturally, since he was drafting it." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw fear in her eyes, fear of what the missing will meant, and the changes. Miss Marple pressed gently. "Were they significant?" Beatrice nodded, her lips tight. "I wanted to include Eleanor more fully. She's been like a daughter to me, and Charles has. Struggled with money? I thought it fair." She stopped, her eyes wet, and Miss Marple understood. A will that split the estate could spark anger, especially in a son like Charles, burdened by debts. Miss Marple patted Beatrice's hand, her mind racing. The will's disappearance tied to Grayson's murder, she thought. Had he been killed? To keep it hidden. She recalled Charles's anger, Lydia's nervousness, Eleanor's fear, and Grayson, his charm, his watchful eyes. Had he known too much? The blackmail note suggested he had, and the orchard meeting hinted at a confrontation gone wrong. She left Beatrice to her orchids and wandered to the study, a wood-panelled room with heavy curtains and a large safe behind a portrait of Sir Reginald. The safe was locked, but Miss Marple noticed faint scratches around the lock, as if someone had tried to force it. In St. Mary Mead, scratches on a jewellery box had led to a thief, and she wondered if someone Charles, perhaps, or Lydia had. Searched for the will. At lunch, the household was tense. The missing will, unspoken but heavy. Charles snapped at Annie when she spilled water, his temper flaring. Lydia laughed too loudly, her necklace twisting in her fingers. Eleanor ate in silence, her eyes on her plate. Miss Marple watched, noting their behaviours, like a St. Mary Mead tea party where every glance hid a motive. She spoke little, letting the others reveal themselves through their unease. After lunch, she found Eleanor in the library, staring at the shelf where the statuette had stood. "It's sad, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice kind. "Such a lovely piece, gone." Eleanor flinched, her hands clenching. "Yes," she whispered. "It reminded me of better times." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw tears in her eyes. In St. Mary Mead, a girl's tears had led to a confession of love, and she wondered if Eleanor's sadness was tied to the will or to Grayson. "Did you know Mr. Grayson well?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. Elinor's face paled, and she shook her head. Not really, she said, too quickly. He was kind, but busy. Her eyes darted to the floor, where the red clay scuff mark lingered, and Miss Marple noted her fear. Elinor knew something, she thought, perhaps about the orchard, where she'd been seen at night. Miss Marple slipped into the hall, where Mrs. Poole was polishing silver, her sharp eyes watching. Mrs. Cinces Poole, Mrs. Marple said, "You must see a lot, keeping this house running." The housekeeper stiffened, her cloth pausing. "I do my job, miss," she said, her voice cold. "I don't pry." But her eyes betrayed her, and Miss Marple knew she saw more than she admitted. Like a St. Mary Mead housekeeper who'd known of a master's affair. As evening fell, Craddock returned, his face grim. "The letter opener was from the study," he said, addressing the household. "Someone took it before the murder, and we found traces of red clay in Grayson's room, matching the garden and orchard." His eyes scanned the room, and Miss Marple saw Charles shift, Lydia's hand freeze on her necklace, Elinor's face pale. The clay, she thought, was the key, linking the library, the orchard, and the murder. She retired to her room, her notebook open, adding, "Will missing, safe, scratches. Beatrice changing will, favours Elinor. Charles expects estate, debts. Lydia nervous knows about will. Elinor scared, tied to Grayson. Mrs. Poole sees all, silent. Clayla brew, garden, Grayson's room. Blackmail, no tortured meeting." The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple felt the truth nearing, hidden, in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 8. A clue in the clather morning mist hung low over Harrow Manor's gardens, softening the edges of the rose bushes and cloaking the orchard in a ghostly haze. Miss Jane Marple stood at her bedroom window, her knitting needles still in her lap, the pink scarf untouched since the previous night's revelations. The murder of Mr. Grayson, stabbed in the rose garden with a dragon-carved letter opener, and the missing will from Sir Reginald's safe had tightened the web of secrets in the house. Her notebook, tucked in her knitting bag, held a growing list of clues: the red clay on Grayson's shoes, and the library floor, the blackmail note. "Pay, or I'll tell." The anonymous warning, "Be careful, Miss Marple." Charles and Lydia's argument about debts, Elinor's nighttime trips to the orchard, and the letter mentioning a meeting there. In St. Mary Mead, such threads had unravelled crimes, and Miss Marple was certain the red clay was a key to unlocking Harrow Manor's mystery. She dressed in her black silk dress, pinning her mother's brooch to the collar, and descended to the dining room for breakfast. The household was subdued, the air heavy with the weight of Grayson's death and Inspector Craddock's ongoing investigation. Lady Beatrice Harrow sat at the head of the table, her emerald brooch catching the light, but her hands trembled as she poured tea. Charles, his tie still askew, stared at his plate, his jaw tight. Lydia, in a green dress, forced a smile, her fingers twisting her pearl necklace. Elinor, pale and silent, kept her eyes down, her hands hidden in her lap. Miss Marple ate quietly, her sharp blue eyes noting every glance, every fidget. In St. Mary Mead, a tense breakfast had revealed a thief's guilt, and she sensed similar tensions here after breakfast. Beatrice retired to the conservatory, Charles to his study, and Lydia to her room, claiming a headache. Elinor lingered, her fingers tracing the table's edge, and Miss Marple saw her chance. "Elinor, dear," she said gently, "would you show me the gardens? I hear they're lovely." Eleanor flinched, her brown eyes wide, but she nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft. Miss Marple smiled, knowing a walk might loosen Eleanor's guard, as it had with a shy St. Mary Mead girl who'd confessed a secret love. They stepped onto the terrace, the air cool and damp. The rose garden, where Grayson's body was found, was cordoned off by Craddock's men, but the orchard beyond beckoned, its trees gnarled and heavy with unripe apples. Miss Marple walked slowly, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, her eyes on the ground. She spotted patches of red clay, the same as on Grayson's shoes and the library floor, scattered along the path leading to the orchard. "Such unusual soil," she said, pausing to kneel. "Not like the black earth in St. Mary Mead." Eleanor nodded, her hands clasped tightly. "It's from the old quarry, I think," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's not far." Past the orchard, Miss Marple's heart quickened. A quarry, she thought, could explain the clayer place where someone might meet in secret or hide something. In St. Mary Mead, a muddy path had led to a poacher's hideout, and she suspected the quarry held answers. "Is it still used?" she asked, her tone light. Eleanor shook her head. "No, it's been closed for years. Too dangerous, they say." Her eyes darted to the orchard, and Miss Marple noted her fear, like a St. Mary Mead girl hiding a forbidden meeting. They returned to the manor, and Miss Marple excused herself, determined to find the quarry. She slipped out through a side door, avoiding Mrs. Poole's sharp eyes, and followed the orchard path. The trees closed around her, their branches casting long shadows, and the ground grew soft with red clay. The path led to a clearing where a rusted gate marked the entrance to the quarry, a shallow pit of red earth, its edges overgrown with weeds. She examined the ground, finding fresh footprints in the clay, one set large, another smaller, Grayson's perhaps, and Eleanor's, or someone else. In St. Mary Mead, footprints had unmasked a thief, and she knew these would matter. A rustle in the bushes made her turn, and an old man appeared, his face weathered, a spade in hand. "Morning, miss," he said, tipping his cap. "You're from the manor, ain't you?" Miss Marple smiled, introducing herself as a guest. "I'm Mr. Tate, the gardener," he said. "Tend the roses, mostly, but I know these grounds." His eyes were kind but sharp, and Miss Marple saw a chance to learn more. "This quarry," she said, "does anyone come here?" Mr. Tate frowned, leaning on his spade. "Not usually. It's off limits, too steep. But I seen tracks lately some. Been about at night." He pointed to the footprints she'd noticed. "Them's fresh, from yesterday, I'd say." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Grayson's shoes, the library scuff, the orchard meeting all tied to this quarry. "Did you see Mr. Grayson here?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mr. Tate hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Saw him a few nights back, talking with someone by the gate. Couldn't see who too dark, but they was arguing, low and fierce." Miss Marple's heart quickened. An argument, she thought, like the one in St. Mary Mead that had led to a stolen will. "Thank you, Mr. Tate," she said, and he nodded, returning to his work. She walked back to the manor, her notebook open in her mind. The quarry was a link. Had been there, arguing, leaving clay on his shoes. The blackmail note, "Pay or I'll tell," suggested he'd been pressing someone, perhaps about the will. Charles's debts, Eleanor's secrecy, Lydia's nerves, all could be motives. And Beatrice, with her fear of the missing will, might know more than she said at lunch. The household was tense, Craddock's questions lingering. Charles snapped at Annie for a spilled spoon. Lydia laughed too loudly. Eleanor stayed silent, and Beatrice's hands shook as she poured tea. Miss Marple watched, noting their behaviours, like a St. Mary Mead tea party where every glance hid a secret. She spoke with Mrs. Poole afterward, asking about the quarry. "It's no place for guests," the housekeeper said sharply, her eyes cold. "Dangerous, and no one goes there." But her tone was too firm, and Miss Marple knew she was hiding something. Like a St. Mary Mead servant who'd covered for a thief. In the afternoon, Craddock returned, his face grim. "We found a key in Grayson's pocket," he said, addressing the household. "It's not for the safe, but it's old. Maybe to another part of the manor. Any ideas?" No one spoke, but Miss Marple saw Eleanor's hands tighten, Lydia's necklace twist, Charles's jaw clench. A key, she thought, could open more than a door, perhaps. A secret tied to the quarry or the will. She retired to her room, her notebook open, adding, "Quarry red clay, footprints, Grayson's argument, Charles angry, debts, hiding something, Eleanor scared, knows quarry, Beatrice will fear, Mrs. Poole defensive, key new clue." The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 9. Eleanor's secret. The afternoon sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Harrow Manor's library, casting a soft glow on the polished shelves where the jade statuette had once stood. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pink scarf in her lap a quiet companion to her racing thoughts. The murder of Mr. Grayson, stabbed in the rose garden with a dragon-carved letter opener, and the missing will from Sir Reginald's safe had turned the manor into a web of suspicion. Her notebook, hidden in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues. The red clay linking the library, orchard, and rose garden. The blackmail note, "Pay or I'll tell." The anonymous warning, "Be careful, Miss Marple." Charles and Lydia's argument about debts. Eleanor's nighttime orchard trips. The cigarette case to clean, the letter about an orchard meeting. The key in Grayson's pocket. And the quarry's footprints. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had unravelled crimes, and Miss Marple was certain Eleanor, with her frightened eyes and secretive ways, held a piece of this puzzle. The household was restless after lunch, with Inspector Craddock still in the village, chasing leads, and the manor's silence heavy with unspoken fears. Lady Beatrice Harrow had retreated to her conservatory, Charles to his study, and Lydia to her room, claiming another headache. Eleanor lingered in the library, her slim figure curled in a chair by the window, a book open but unread in her lap. Miss Marple saw her chance, knowing from St. Mary Mead that a quiet moment could coax secrets from even the shyest soul, like a girl who'd confessed to stealing after a gentle chat over tea. She approached Eleanor, her steps soft on the thick carpet. "May I join you, dear?" she asked, her voice warm and kind. Eleanor started, her brown eyes wide, but she nodded, closing her book. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled, and Miss Marple noted the way they clutched the book, like a St. Mary Mead girl gripping a letter from a forbidden lover. "It's a lovely room," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, her knitting resuming its rhythm. "So peaceful, despite everything." She let the words hang, her eyes on Eleanor, inviting her to speak. Eleanor's lips parted, then closed, her fingers tightening. "It's not peaceful," she said at last, her voice breaking. "Not any more." Miss Marple nodded, her face gentle but her mind sharp. In St. Mary Mead, a girl's tears had led to a truth about a theft, and she sensed Eleanor was close to revealing something. "You seem troubled, dear," Miss Marple said, her tones soft as a lullaby. "Sometimes sharing a worry makes it lighter. I've seen it in my village people carry burdens alone when a kind ear can help." She smiled, her eyes warm, and Eleanor's shoulders slumped as if the weight of her silence was too much. "It's hard," Eleanor whispered, her eyes on the floor. "Mr. Grayson, he knew something about me, something I didn't want anyone to know." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple leaned closer, her knitting paused. "What did he know?" she asked, her voice steady, like a St. Mary Mead aunt coaxing a confession. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Miss Marple, her face pale. "I'm not Beatrice's niece," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm her daughter, her real daughter. She had me before she married Sir Reginald, but no one could know. It would ruin her." Her hands shook, and she wiped her eyes. "Grayson found out, somehow. He said he'd tell everyone unless I helped him." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. A secret child, she thought, was a powerful motive, especially tied to a will. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden family tie had led to a forged document, and she wondered if Eleanor's secret was the key to Grayson's murder. "Helped him how?" she asked, her voice gentle. Eleanor shook her head, her hair falling over her face. "He wanted money, I think, or something from the estate. I didn't understand it all. He kept asking about the will, about what Beatrice planned. I told him I didn't know, but he wouldn't stop." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw fear in her eyes, fear of exposure, or worse. "Did you meet him in the orchard?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft but probing, recalling Eleanor's nighttime trips and the letter about a meeting there. Eleanor's face paled, and she nodded. "Once, a few nights ago," she admitted. "He said to come alone, but I was scared. I left early, before he could say more." Her hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the truth in her fear, but also the gaps. Had Eleanor returned later, perhaps with the letter opener? "I won't tell anyone," Miss Marple said, patting Eleanor's hand. "But you must be careful, dear. Secrets have a way of coming out." She smiled, her mind racing. Eleanor's parentage changed everything: the will, Grayson's blackmail, the murder. If Beatrice planned to favor Eleanor, Charles's inheritance was at risk, and his debts made that a motive. Lydia, too, might fear losing her status. And Grayson, had he pushed Eleanor too far, or someone else protecting her? Eleanor excused herself, her eyes red, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts on the will. Beatrice had said it was meant to split the estate between Charles and Eleanor, a decision that could spark rage in a son expecting it all. She recalled the scratches on the safe, the blackmail note, the red clay linking the orchard, library, and rose garden. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden heir had led to a desperate act, and she suspected Harrow Manor's secrets were just as deadly. She slipped into the hall, where Mrs. Poole was polishing a vase, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Mrs. Poole," Miss Marple said, her voice light, "you must know the Manor's history well. Has there ever been talk of family secrets?" The housekeeper stiffened, her cloth pausing. "No, miss," she said, her voice cold. "The Harrows are private folk." But her eyes flickered, and Miss Marple knew she was lying. Like a St. Mary Mead servant hiding a master's shame-dotted dinner. The household was tense, Craddock's absence leaving them to stew in their fears. Charles drank his wine too quickly, his temper flaring when Annie dropped a spoon. Lydia's laughter was sharp, her necklace twisting in her fingers. Eleanor ate in silence, her eyes on her plate. Beatrice tried to keep the mood light, but her hands shook as she spoke of the gardens. Miss Marple watched, noting every glance, every gesture. Like a St. Mary Mead tea party where secrets simmered beneath polite smiles. After dinner, returned, his face grim. "We found a torn letter in the orchard," he said, addressing the household. "It mentions the will and a meeting with Grayson. Anyone know about it?" No one spoke, but Miss Marple saw Eleanor's hands tremble. Lydia's necklace pause, Charles's jaw tighten. The letter, she thought, tied to Eleanor's secret and Grayson's blackmail. Had he threatened to expose her, or was the will itself the prize? She retired to her room, her notebook open, adding, "Eleanor Beatrice's daughter, blackmailed by Grayson, will splits estate. Motive for Charles, Lydia. Mrs. Poole hiding knowledge. Torn letter will, orchard meeting, clay quarry library, garden." The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 10. The second incident. The evening shadows stretched long across Harrow Manor, their edges creeping over the polished floors and up the panelled walls, as if the house itself were trying to hide its secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting needles idle in her lap, the pink scarf untouched as her sharp blue eyes fixed on the orchard beyond the window. The murder of Mr. Grayson, stabbed in the rose garden with a dragon-carved letter opener, and the missing will from Sir Reginald's safe had woven a tight web of suspicion around the household. Her notebook, tucked in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues. The red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note, "Pay or I'll tell." The anonymous warning, "Be careful, Miss Marple," Charles and Lydia's. Argument about debts. Eleanor's nighttime orchard trips, and her secret as Beatrice's daughter. The cigarette case, to clean. The letter about an orchard meeting. The key in Grayson's pocket. And the torn letter mentioning the will. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had unravelled crimes, and Miss Marple was certain the truth was close. Hidden in the Manor's shadows, she had just closed her notebook, adding Eleanor's confession that she was Beatrice's secret daughter, blackmailed by Grayson when a sharp smell cut through the air, smoke, acrid and unmistakable. Her heart quickened, and she rose, her black silk dress rustling as she moved to the door. A faint haze drifted down the hall, and she heard shouts from below Charles's voice, loud and angry, and Annie, the young maid, crying out in panic. Miss Marple hurried to the staircase, her steps steady despite her age, knowing from St. Mary Mead that smoke often meant more than an accident. A fire in a vicarage attic had once hidden a thief's tracks, and she suspected this was no different. The household was gathering in the entrance hall, their faces pale in the flickering light of the chandelier. Beatrice, her emerald brooch glinting, clutched the banister, her eyes wide with fear. "The attic," she gasped. "It's on fire." Charles was already moving, barking orders at Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, who stood rigid, her sharp eyes darting to the stairs. Lydia, in a red dress, twisted her pearl necklace, her voice shrill. "How did this happen? We could lose everything." Eleanor stood apart, her hands clenched, her face pale as she stared upward. Miss Marple noted their reactions, each a clue. Beatrice's fear, Charles's command, Lydia's panic, Eleanor's silence. Mrs. Poole snapped at Annie, "Fetch buckets quick." The maid ran, her apron flapping, and Charles led the way to the attic stairs, a narrow spiral at the back of the house. Miss Marple followed, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her mind racing. The smoke grew thicker as they climbed, stinging her eyes. But she pressed on, recalling a St. Mary Mead fire that had revealed a hidden theft. The attic door was ajar, flames licking at stacks of old boxes and papers, the air hot and heavy. Charles and Mrs. Poole threw water from buckets Annie brought, dousing the flames, while Lydia and Eleanor stood back, their faces tense. The fire was small but fierce. Confined to a corner where old trunks and files were stored, Miss Marple stayed. Near the door, her eyes scanning the scene. The flames had charred a pile of papers, but some were only singed, their edges curling like secrets trying to escape. She knelt, careful not to disturb the mess, and picked up a fragment. It was a letter, dated years ago, mentioning Charles's gambling debts and a loan from a London lender. "Repay or face ruin," it read, the ink smudged but clear. Miss Marple's heart quickened. In St. Mary Mead, a burned letter had pointed to a desperate act, and this one suggested Charles's debts were deeper than she'd guessed. "Faulty wiring," Lydia said, her voice loud as the last flames died. "It must be the wiring old houses, you know." She laughed, a sharp sound, her hand at her necklace. Miss Marple watched her, noting the quickness of her excuse, like a St. Mary Mead woman covering a lie. Charles nodded, his face red from the effort, but his eyes avoided the papers. "We'll get it fixed," he muttered, kicking a charred box aside. Beatrice, pale and shaking, said nothing, her hands clutching her brooch. Eleanor stared at the floor, her silence heavy. Miss Marple slipped the singed letter into her pocket, her mind racing. The fire was no accident, she thought. Someone had set it to destroy evidence, perhaps, about Charles's debts, or something tied to the will. She recalled the blackmail note from the library, the mention of payment. Had Grayson known about Charles's debts, using them to press for money or power? In St. Mary Mead, a fire had hidden a forged cheque, and she suspected this blaze was meant to erase a trail. Inspector Craddock arrived soon after, summoned by Annie, his face grim as he surveyed the attic. "Lucky it didn't spread," he said, his notebook out. "Any idea what started it?" Lydia repeated her wiring theory, but Craddock's eyes narrowed, and Miss Marple saw he wasn't convinced. He examined the charred papers, finding more fragments about debts and estate finances, but nothing about the will. "These are old," he said, "but someone didn't want them seen." Miss Marple nodded to herself, agreeing. The fire was deliberate, and the target was clear. Craddock questioned the household, his voice sharp. "Anyone up here last night or today?" No one spoke, but Miss Marple saw Charles's jaw tighten, Lydia's fingers twist her necklace, Eleanor's eyes drop. Beatrice said she hadn't been to the attic in months, and Mrs. Poole claimed she'd been in the kitchen all morning. Annie stammered, saying she'd been cleaning downstairs. Miss Marple noted their alibis, each as vague as the night of Grayson's murder. Like a St. Mary Mead case where lies piled up like leaves. After Craddock left to investigate the village, Miss Marple sought out Beatrice in the conservatory where the orchids glowed in the fading light. "Beatrice," she said gently, "this fire, it's troubling, after everything else." Beatrice's hands shook as she clipped a leaf, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "Just an accident, Jane," she said, but her voice was thin. Miss Marple pressed softly. "Those papers mentioned Charles's debts. Did Grayson know?" Beatrice flinched, her scissors pausing. "He might have," she admitted. Charles has struggled, and Grayson handled the accounts. I didn't want to worry you." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the blackmail note. Grayson's knowledge, she thought, was a motive for murder. She wandered to the library, hoping to find more clues. The red clay scuff mark was still there, faint but telling, linking the statuette's fall to the orchard, quarry, and rose garden. She pictured Grayson here, perhaps finding the blackmail note, then meeting someone in the orchard, where the clay stained his shoes. The fire, she thought, was another link, someone burning papers to hide what Grayson knew. Charles's debts, Eleanor's parentage, the will were threads in the same web-dotted dinner. The household was tense, the fire adding to their fears. Charles drank heavily, his temper flaring when Annie spilled water. Lydia's laughter was forced, her necklace twisting in her fingers. Eleanor ate in silence, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. Beatrice tried to talk of the gardens, but her voice shook. Miss Marple watched, noting their behaviours, like a St. Mary Mead tea party where every glance hid a secret. She retired. To her room, her notebook open, adding, fire attic, deliberate, Charles's debt papers, Beatrice knows of debts, scared, Charles angry, hiding something, Lydia quick, with wiring excuse, Eleanor crying, tied to will, Mrs. Poole silent, watchful, clay links all scenes. The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple felt the truth nearing, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Chapter 11. The village connection, the morning mist had burned away, leaving Harrow Manor bathed in pale sunlight that did little to lift the gloom hanging over its stone walls. Miss Jane Marple stood at her bedroom window, her knitting needles still in her lap, the pink scarf untouched as her sharp blue eyes traced the orchard's twisted trees. The murder of Mr. Grayson, stabbed in the rose garden with a dragon-carved letter opener. The missing will, and the attic fire that destroyed. Papers about Charles's debts had woven a tight web of suspicion around the household. Her notebook, hidden in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues, the red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note, "Pay or I'll tell." The anonymous warning, "Be careful, Miss Marple." Charles and Lydia's argument about debts, Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter, the cigarette case to clean, the letter about an orchard meeting, the key in Grayson's pocket, the torn letter mentioning the will, and the singed debt papers. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had unravelled crimes, and Miss Marple was certain the village of Ashford Vale, just a mile from the manor, held answers to this puzzle. She dressed in her black silk dress, pinning her mother's brooch to the collar, and decided to visit the village, knowing from St. Mary Mead that local gossip often revealed what a grand house hid. At breakfast, the household was tense, the fire and Grayson's death casting a shadow. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her emerald brooch glinting, sipped tea with trembling hands. Charles, his tie askew, pushed his bacon round his plate, his jaw tight. Lydia, in a violet dress, forced a smile, her fingers at her pearl necklace. Eleanor, pale and silent, stared at her toast, her hands hidden. Miss Marple ate quietly, noting their behaviours, Beatrice's fear, Charles's anger, Lydia's nerves. Eleanor's silence, like a St. Mary Mead tea party where every glance held a secret. She excused herself, saying she fancied a walk to the village, and Beatrice offered Mr. Dobbs, the driver, but Miss Marple declined, preferring the freedom to observe. The path to Ashford Vale wound through fields and hedgerows, the air cool with a hint of rain. Her sensible shoes crunched on gravel, and she clutched her shawl, her mind on the clues. The red clay, the blackmail note, Eleanor's secret, the fire all pointed to a motive tied to the will or Charles's debts. In St. Mary Mead, a village chat had once unmasked a thief, and she hoped Ashford Vale's tongues would wag. The village was small, with stone cottages, a church, and a post office that doubled as a shop. Miss Marple entered the post office, where a plump woman with grey curls stood behind the counter, sorting letters. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "I'm visiting Harrow Manor and thought I'd see the village." The woman, introducing herself as Mrs. Carter, the postmistress, smiled, eager for news. "Terrible business at the manor," she said, her eyes bright. "Mr. Grayson, murdered. We heard it this morning." Miss Marple nodded, her face sympathetic. "Such a shock," she said. "Did you know him?" Mrs. Carter leaned closer, her voice low. "Oh, he came here often, posting letters, buying stamps. Charming man, but, well, he had a way of asking questions, poking into folks' business." She paused, glancing at the door. "A few days back, I saw him arguing with a stranger outside Torman, city clothes, angry as anything." Miss Marple's heart quickened. In St. Mary Mead, a stranger's argument had led to a blackmailer, and she wondered if this man was tied to Grayson's death. "What sort of argument?" she asked, her tone light. Mrs. Carter frowned, sorting envelopes. "Couldn't hear much, but Grayson looked worried." The man handed him a letter, postmarked London, then left in a huff. A London letter, Miss Marple thought, like the anonymous note in her room. "Do you recall anything about the letter?" she asked. Mrs. Carter shook her head. "Just the postmark. Grayson tucked it away quick, like he didn't want it seen." Miss Marple thanked her and bought a postcard, her mind racing. A stranger, a London letter, an argument. Grayson had been tangled in something beyond the manor, perhaps tied to the blackmail note or the will. She wandered to the village pub, the Red Lion, where a few locals sipped pints. The barman, a stout man named Mr. Finch, greeted her warmly, and she ordered tea, settling at a corner table. "Sad news about Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice soft. Mr. Finch nodded, wiping a glass. He was in here sometimes, chatting with folk. Always asking about the manor, the Harrow's money troubles." He lowered his voice. "Heard him talk of debts once, with that same stranger Mrs. Carter mentioned. Sounded like trouble." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts on Charles's debts and the burned papers. In St. Mary Mead, pub gossip had revealed a swindler's plans, and this stranger's connection to Grayson suggested a deeper scheme. She thanked Mr. Finch and returned to the manor, the villagers' whispers adding to her puzzle. The London letter, the stranger, Grayson's questions all pointed to blackmail or a secret tied to the estate. Back at the manor, lunch was a strained affair. Charles snapped at Annie for a slow service. Lydia laughed too loudly. Eleanor stayed silent, and Beatrice's hands shook as she poured tea. Miss Marple watched, noting their unease, like a St. Mary Mead gathering where lies simmered. She spoke with Mrs. Poole afterward, asking about Grayson's visitors. He had none, the housekeeper said sharply, her eyes cold. Kept to himself. Mostly, but her tone was too firm, and Miss Marple knew she was hiding something, like a St. Mary Mead servant covering a scandal. In the afternoon, Craddock returned, his face grim. "We traced the London postmark," he said, addressing the household. "A letter to Grayson, sent days before his death, mentioning a debt repayment. Anyone know about it?" No one spoke, but Miss Marple saw Charles's jaw clench, Lydia's necklace twist, Eleanor's hands tremble. The letter, she thought, tied to the stranger, the blackmail, and perhaps the murder. She retired to her room, her notebook open, adding, village stranger, London letter, Grayson's argument, Charles debts, angry, Lydia nervous, hiding. Something, Eleanor scared, silent, Mrs. Lion, letter debt, blackmail link. The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple felt the truth nearing, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Manor. Asterisk. Chapter 12. The shocking revelation. The late afternoon light poured through the tall windows of Harrow Manor's drawing-room, casting long shadows across the polished floor and heavy velvet curtains. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles silent in her lap, the pink scarf untouched as her sharp blue eyes studied the gathered household. The murder of Mr. Grayson, stabbed in the rose garden with a dragon-carved letter opener, the missing will, the attic fire, and the web of secrets had brought the manor to a breaking point. Her notebook, hidden in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues, the red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden, the blackmail note, pay or I'll tell, the anonymous warning, be careful, Miss Marple, Charles and Lydia's argument about debts, Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter, the cigarette case, to clean, the letter about an orchard meeting, the key in Grayson's pocket, the torn letter mentioning the will, the singed debt papers, and the village gossip about argument with a stranger and a London letter. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had unravelled crimes, and Miss Marple was ready to lay bare the truth. The household was summoned by Inspector Craddock, who stood by the fireplace, his notebook ready but his eyes on Miss Marple, sensing her moment had come. Lady Beatrice Harrow sat near the window, her emerald brooch glinting, her hands trembling. Charles, his tie askew, paced by the mantel, his jaw tight. Lydia, in a crimson dress, forced a smile, her fingers twisting her pearl necklace. Eleanor, pale and silent, sat with her hands clasped, her brown eyes downcast. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her sharp eyes watchful, while Annie, the nervous maid, hovered nearby, her apron twisted in her hands. The air was thick with tension, like a St. Mary Mead gathering before a scandal broke. Miss Marple rose, her black silk dress rustling, her voice calm but firm. "I've been watching and listening," she said, her eyes moving over the room. "Harrow Manor holds secrets, and Mr. Grayson's death is tied to them. Let's start with the facts." She paused, her tone gentle but commanding, as she had in St. Mary Mead when unmasking a thief. Grayson was stabbed in the rose garden with a letter opener from the study. Red clay on his shoes linked him to the orchard and quarry, where he met someone the night he died. A blackmail note in the library suggested he was pressing someone, and a letter mentioned a meeting in the orchard. The will, meant to split the estate between Charles and Eleanor, is missing, and the attic fire destroyed papers about Charles's debts. Beatrice gasped, her hand at her brooch. Charles stopped pacing, his face red. Lydia's smile faltered, her necklace twisting. Eleanor's hands tightened, her eyes wide. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. Grayson was blackmailing someone, likely about Charles's debts or Eleanor's parentage. He knew Eleanor was Beatrice's daughter, not her niece, a secret that could change the will. He argued with a stranger in the village, tied to a London letter about debts. But the key lies in the red clay, ties the library, where the statuette was broken, to the orchard, the quarry, and the rose garden. She turned to Charles, her eyes kind but piercing. "Charles, You spoke of debts, argued with Lydia about Grayson's interference. You were in your study the night he died, but your alibi is weak. Did Grayson threaten to expose your debts? Perhaps to ruin you? Charles's face darkened, his fists clenching. I didn't kill him, he growled. He was a nuisance, yes, but I was working. Miss Marple nodded, noting his anger, like a St. Mary Mead farmer caught in a lie. She turned to Eleanor, her voice softer. Eleanor, you admitted Grayson blackmailed you about your parentage. You were in the orchard, meeting him, scared of what he'd reveal. Did you fear for Beatrice or yourself? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper. I didn't hurt him. I ran away that night, before anything happened. Miss Marple believed her, sensing truth in her fear, like a St. Mary Mead girl confessing a secret love. Then she faced Lydia, her eyes narrowing. Lydia, you've been nervous, always touching your necklace, quick to call the statuettes. Fall and the fire accidents. You knew of Charles's debts, feared losing the estate if the will favored Eleanor. Grayson's blackmail threatened your future, didn't it? Lydia laughed, a sharp sound, her hand frozen on her necklace. That's absurd, she said, but her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw guilt in her eyes, like a St. Mary Mead. Woman hiding a theft. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice rising. The red clay tells the story. Grayson was in the quarry, arguing, perhaps, with the stranger from London. He returned to the library, where the statuette was broken to distract us. Then he was lured to the rose garden, where the letter opener taken from the study ended his life. The cigarette case, to clean, was placed to mislead. The fire burned debt papers, hiding Charles's shame, but only one person connects it. Or Lydia. The room froze, Lydia's face paling. Me, she gasped, her hand dropping. Miss Marple continued, her tone relentless. You knew Grayson's blackmail could ruin Charles's inheritance. You broke the statuette to create chaos, met Grayson in the quarry, and lured him to the rose garden, where you stabbed him. You set the fire to destroy evidence of Charles's debts, protecting your status. The clay on your shoes, Lydia, from the quarry, was seen by Annie when you returned that night. Lydia stood, her eyes wild. You're wrong, I was in bed. But Annie, trembling, spoke up. I saw her, miss, late, with mud on her shoes. Lydia's face crumpled, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck the truth, as she had in St. Mary Mead when a liar's mask fell. Craddock stepped forward, his voice calm. Mrs. Harrow will need to talk. Lydia's shoulders sagged, her necklace still in her hand, and Miss Marple felt a pang of pity, but also resolve. The truth, she knew, was never kind, but it was necessary. She retired to her room, her notebook open, adding, Lydia murderer, blackmailed by Grayson, clay on shoes. Charles debts, motive, but innocent. Eleanor protected, scared. Beatrice, grief, fire hid debts. The puzzle was nearly solved, and Miss Marple felt the weight lifting, though one task remained. Chapter 13. The trap is set. The evening light faded over Harrow Manor, casting a soft glow through the drawing-room's tall windows, where shadows danced on the polished floor and heavy curtains. Miss Jane Marple sat in her corner, her knitting, needles still, the pink scarf untouched in her lap as her sharp blue eyes watched the household. The revelation of Lydia as Mr. Grayson's murdered, driven by fear of losing the estate to Eleanor's inheritance, and Grayson's blackmail over Charles's debts, had shaken the manor to its core. Yet Miss Marple knew from her St. Mary Mead days that a deduction, however sound, needed proof to seal the truth. Her notebook, hidden in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues. The red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note, pay or I'll tell. The anonymous warning, be careful, Miss Marple. Charles and Lydia's argument. Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter. The cigarette case to clean. The orchard meeting letter. The key in Grayson's pocket. The torn will letter. The singed debt papers. And the village gossip about a London stranger. Now she needed to trap Lydia into betraying herself, as she had once trapped a St. Mary Mead thief with a clever ruse. The household gathered, their faces drawn, the air thick with tension. Lady Beatrice Harrow sat by the fire, her emerald brooch glinting, her hands trembling as she clutched a teacup. Charles, his tie askew, stood by the window, his jaw tight with anger and shock at Lydia's accusation. Lydia, in a dark blue dress, forced a smile, her fingers twisting her pearl necklace, her eyes darting nervously. Eleanor, pale and silent, sat with her hands clasped, her brown eyes fixed on the floor. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her sharp eyes watchful, while Annie, the nervous maid, hovered nearby, her apron twisted in her hands. Inspector Craddock, summoned by Miss Marple, stood by the mantel, his notebook ready, his face calm but expectant. He trusted her instincts, having seen her unravel St. Mary Mead mysteries, and he waited for her move. Miss Marple rose, her black silk dress rustling, her voice gentle but firm. "We've faced a terrible crime," she said, her eyes moving over the room. Mr. Grayson's death was no accident, and the clues read clay, a blackmail note, a missing will point to a desperate act. But to be certain, we must test the truth. She paused, her tone measured, as she had in St. Mary Mead when setting a trap for a liar. "Inspector, please share the new evidence you found today." She nodded to Craddock, who understood her. Plan, a tactic they'd used before to flush out a culprit. Craddock cleared his throat, his voice grave. "We found a forged letter in the orchard, hidden in a hollow tree," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "It implicates the killer, naming them clearly, and mentions the will and Grayson's blackmail. We're having it examined, but it's damning." The letter was a fiction, a bait Miss Marple had suggested to Craddock in a quiet moment, knowing a guilty soul would react. In St. Mary Mead, a false rumour of a witness had trapped a thief, and she hoped this would do the same. Lydia's face paled, her hand frozen on her necklace. "A letter," she said, her voice high. "That's impossible." Her eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple noted the panic, like a St. Mary Mead woman caught in a lie. Charles frowned, his hands clenching. "What letter?" he demanded, but his voice was unsteady, as if he feared its contents. Beatrice's cup rattled in its saucer, her eyes wide. Eleanor's hands tightened, but she stayed silent, her fear palpable. Mrs. Poole's eyes narrowed, and Annie gasped softly, her apron twisting harder. Miss Marple watched Lydia closely, her mind sharp. "The letter mentions the quarry," she said, her voice soft but piercing. "The red clay on Grayson's shoes, the same clay on the killer's, points to a meeting there before the murder. The letter opener, taken from the study, was no random choice. It tied to the broken statuette, a distraction to cover the crime." Lydia's smile vanished, her lips trembling, and Miss Marple pressed on. The fire in the attic, burning. Charles's debt papers, was meant to hide Grayson's blackmail, but the clay, Lydia, betrays you. Annie saw it on your shoes that night. Lydia stood, her face white. "You're lying," she cried, her voice breaking. "There's no letter." I was in bed, but her eyes betrayed her, wild with fear, and she moved toward the door, her steps quick. Miss Marple nodded to Craddock, who stepped forward, his voice calm. "Mrs. Harrow, stay where you are." But Lydia bolted, shoving past Annie, who yelped, and ran down the hall toward the terrace. Craddock and his men followed, with Miss Marple trailing, her steps steady. The household rushed after, their voices a mix of shock and confusion. Lydia reached the terrace, her breath ragged, and fumbled in her pocket, dropping a small glass vial that rolled across the stone. Miss Marple's heart quickened, she recognized. The shape, like a St. Mary mead vial used for poison. Craddock seized it, his face grim. "What's this, Mrs. Harrow?" he asked, holding it up. Lydia froze, her eyes wide, and Miss Marple knew it was over. "It's poison," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying. "Meant for Eleanor, I suspect, to ensure she couldn't inherit. You killed Grayson to protect Charles's claim to the estate, Lydia, and planned to silence Eleanor to secure it." Lydia's shoulders sagged, her face crumpling, and she sank to the ground, sobbing. "I had to," she whispered. "He'd ruin U.S. Grayson, knew everything, the debts, the will. I couldn't let him take it all." Beatrice gasped, her hand at her brooch, tears in her eyes. Charles stared at his wife, his face a mix of shock and betrayal. Eleanor's hands covered her mouth, her eyes wet. Mrs. Poole's face was stone, but Annie's tears flowed freely. Craddock signalled his men, who gently lifted Lydia, her wrists bound, and led her to the police car waiting outside. Miss Marple watched, her heart heavy but resolved, as she had been in St. Mary Mead when justice caught a liar. Back in the drawing room, Craddock confirmed the vial was cyanide, enough to kill. "We'll search her room," he said, "but this, with Anna's testimony and the clay, is enough." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the clues. The red clay on Lydia's shoes, seen by Annie. The letter opener, taken from the study. The fire, set to hide Charles's debts. The blackmail note, Grayson's tool to pressure Lydia, in St. Mary Mead. A single clue had trapped a killer, and here the pieces had fallen into place. She retired to her room, her notebook open, adding, "Lydia confirmed, poison vial, clay." On shoes, trap-forged letter, worked. Eleanor targeted, safe now. Charles debts, innocent. Beatrice grief, will. Justice served. The puzzle was nearly complete, and Miss Marple felt the Manor's shadows lifting, though one final step remained. Chapter 14. The Manor's peace restored. The morning sun rose over Harrow Manor, its golden light filtering through the tall windows and softening the shadows that had clung to the house for days. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pink scarf nearly finished in her lap. The air was lighter now, though a quiet sadness lingered after Lydia's confession the previous evening. Her admission to murdering Mr. Grayson, driven by fear of losing the estate to Eleanor's inheritance and Grayson's blackmail over Charles's debts, had unravelled the Manor's web of secrets. Miss Marple's notebook, tucked in her knitting bag, held the clues that had led to this moment. The red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note, "Pay or I'll tell." The anonymous warning, "Be careful." Miss Marple, Charles, and Lydia's argument. Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter. The cigarette case, to clean. The orchard meeting letter, the key in Grayson's pocket, the torn will letter, the singed debt papers, the village gossip about a London stranger, and the poison vial Lydia had meant for Eleanor. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had closed cases, and here they had brought justice that the household gathered. For breakfast, their faces marked by relief but also grief. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her emerald brooch glinting, poured tea with steady hands, though her eyes were red from crying. Charles, his tie finally neat, ate quietly, his anger softened by the truth about his wife. Eleanor, no longer hiding her face, sat with a tentative smile, her brown eyes meeting Beatrice's with newfound warmth. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, supervised the meal with her usual sharpness, but her stern face held a trace of respect for Miss Marple. The nervous maid, moved with less fear, her apron still but her eyes bright with gratitude. Inspector Craddock had left to finalize Lydia's arrest, promising to return with news, and the manor felt like a house waking from a bad dream. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind on the one piece still missing, the will, Beatrice had said. It was meant to split the estate between Charles and Eleanor, a decision that had sparked Lydia's desperation. The scratches on the study safe suggested someone likely Lydia had tried to steal it, and Miss Marple suspected it was still in the manor, hidden to protect Lydia's plans. In St. Mary Mead, a missing document had been found in a servant's room, and she wondered if Mrs. Poole or Annie might know more. After breakfast, she approached Beatrice, who was arranging roses in the conservatory, their scent mingling with the morning air. Beatrice, Miss Marple said gently, "The will, have you checked the study again? It may still be here." Beatrice's hands paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "I looked, Jane, but it's gone. Grayson had it last, in the safe." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw her fear, like a St. Mary Mead widow hiding a family secret. "May I see the study?" Miss Marple asked, her tone kind but firm. Beatrice nodded, leading her to the wood-panelled room, where Sir Reginald's portrait loomed over the safe. Miss Marple examined the scratches, faint but telling, and noticed a small keyhole in a desk. "Drawer, overlooked before." "The key in Grayson's pocket," she said, her heart quickening. "It wasn't for the safe, perhaps for this." Beatrice frowned, but fetched Craddock's evidence bag, which held the key found on Grayson's body. Miss Marple tried the key in the drawer, and it clicked open, revealing a folded document sealed with wax. Beatrice gasped, her hand at her brooch. "The will," she whispered, unfolding it. The paper named Charles and Eleanor as equal heirs, with a note ensuring Eleanor's legitimacy as Beatrice's daughter. Miss Marple smiled, her mind clear. Lydia had hidden the will here, hoping to destroy it later, but Grayson's key had kept it safe. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden letter had solved a theft, and this will closed the case. They returned to the drawing room, where Charles and Eleanor joined them. Beatrice read the will aloud, her voice steady, and Charles's face softened, his hand reaching for Eleanor's. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low. "I'd have shared it if I'd known." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, and she nodded, a weight lifting. Miss Marple watched, her heart warm, knowing truth could heal as well as hurt, as it had in St. Mary Mead. She slipped into the hall, where Annie was dusting, her hands steady now. "Annie," Miss Marple said softly, "the note you left me." "You," Annie blushed, her eyes wide. I was scared, miss, but you seemed kind. I saw Mrs. Lydia in the quarry, and I thought you should know." Miss Marple nodded. The anonymous warning, "Be careful." Miss Marple explained. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's courage had unmasked a liar, and Annie's note had set her on the right path. Craddock returned at noon, confirming Lydia's confession. She admitted it all, he said, addressing the household. Grayson was blackmailing her about Charles's debts and Eleanor's parentage, threatening to expose them unless she paid. She broke the statuette to create chaos, met him in the quarry, lured him to the rose garden, and stabbed him. The fire was to burn the debt papers, and the poison was for Eleanor to secure the estate. He paused, his eyes on Miss Marple. Your trap worked, Miss Marple. The forged letter made her panic. She smiled faintly, her role complete, as it had been in St. Mary Mead when justice prevailed. As evening fell, Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her knitting bag ready for the journey back to St. Mary Mead. Beatrice walked her to the car, her face lighter now. Jane, you've saved us, she said, her hand squeezing Miss Marple's. I'll never forget it. Miss Marple smiled, her heart full. People are the same everywhere, Beatrice, she said. They hide, but the truth comes out. Mr. Dobbs drove her to the station, the manor fading into the dusk. Miss Marple sat back, her notebook closed, her mind at rest. The red clay, the notes, the will-all had led to Lydia's downfall, and Harrow Manor was free. In St. Mary Mead, she'd solved smaller puzzles, but the principle was the same. Watch, listen, and the truth appears. She hummed softly, her needles clicking, ready for the next mystery life might bring. Chapter 15. The shadows lift the late summer sun-bathed Harrow Manor in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the tall windows of the drawing-room, where the heavy velvet curtains seemed less oppressive than they had days before. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pink scarf now nearly complete in her lap. The manor, once a maze of secrets and suspicion, felt lighter, as if the truth about Mr. Grayson's murder and Lydia's arrest had lifted a dark veil. Her notebook, tucked in her knitting bag, held the clues that had unravelled the mystery. The red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note. Pay or I'll tell. The anonymous warning, be careful, Miss Marple, Charles and Lydia's argument about debts. Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter. The cigarette case, to clean. The orchard meeting letter. The key in Grayson's pocket. The torn will letter. The singed debt papers. The village. Gossip about a London stranger. The attic fire. And the poison vial Lydia had meant for Eleanor. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had solved crimes, and here they had brought justice. But Miss Marple knew some threads remained to be woven into the tapestry. The household gathered for a final tea, their faces marked by a mix of relief and sorrow. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her emerald brooch glinting, poured tea with steady hands, though her eyes held a quiet grief for the betrayal of her daughter-in-law. Charles, his tie neatly knotted for once, sat with a softened expression, his anger replaced by a weary acceptance. Eleanor, no longer hiding behind her soft brown hair, sat close to Beatrice, her eyes bright with a tentative hope. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, supervised Annie, the young maid, who moved with newfound confidence, her apron still but her smile genuine. Inspector Craddock had sent word that Lydia's trial was set, and the manor was settling into a fragile peace. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp blue eyes noting the subtle shifts in their demeanour. Like a St. Mary Mead tea party where healing began after a scandal. Beatrice spoke first, her voice warm but tinged with sadness. Jane, I can't thank you enough, she said, setting her cup down. You saw what we couldn't, what Lydia was hiding, what Grayson's death meant. You've given us a chance to start again. Her hand reached for Eleanor's, and Miss Marple saw a mother's love, no longer hidden, in her gesture. In St. Mary Mead, a family reunited after a secret's reveal had brought tears and joy, and she sensed the same here. Charles cleared his throat, his voice low. I was blind, he said, his eyes on his tea. I knew Lydia was worried about money, but I never thought, not murder. He looked at Eleanor, his face softening further. You're my sister, Eleanor. The will. Right, sharing the estate. I'll manage the debts, somehow. Eleanor's eyes welled, and she nodded, her hands squeezing Beatrice's. Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by their reconciliation, like a St. Mary Mead family mending after a betrayal. But one question lingered in Miss Marple's mind, the anonymous note, "Be careful, Miss Marple." Annie had admitted to leaving it, warning her about Lydia's quarry visit, but its tone suggested more knowledge, and the London stranger, seen arguing with Grayson, remained a shadow. In St. Mary Mead, loose ends had led to deeper truths, and Miss Marple wanted to be sure no secrets remained. She excused herself after tea, seeking Annie in the kitchen, where the maid was polishing silver. "Annie, dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice inviting confidence. "Your note helped greatly, but did you know more about Mr. Grayson's plans?" Annie blushed, her hands pausing. I heard him talking, miss, in the study, days before. He was on the telephone, saying he'd meet someone from London, about money. I didn't understand it all, but he sounded angry, and I was scared for you, poking about." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the piece into place. In St. Mary Mead, a servant's eavesdropping had solved a theft, and Annie's words pointed to Grayson's wider schemes. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room where Beatrice was, alone, arranging roses in a vase. "Beatrice," she said softly, "did Grayson have business in London, perhaps tied to Charles's debts?" Beatrice's hands froze, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "He did," she admitted. "He handled our accounts, and Charles's creditors were in London. Grayson said he'd settle things, but I didn't trust him fully." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw guilt, like a St. Mary Mead widow hiding a mistake. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the London stranger, likely a creditor Grayson had met, perhaps pressing for payment or offering a deal that led to their argument in the village. The blackmail note, "Pay or I'll tell," suggested Grayson used his knowledge to extort money, not just from Lydia, but possibly from others. The stranger, she reasoned, was a loose end, not the killer, but a spark in Grayson's schemes. In St. Mary Mead, a stranger's visit had clarified a fraud, and here it completed the picture of Grayson's greed. She wandered to the study, where the will had been found in a desk drawer, unlocked by Grayson's key. The safe, with its scratches, told of Lydia's attempt to steal it, but Miss Marple noticed a small ledger on the desk, overlooked before. She opened it, finding entries of payments to a London firm, marked with Grayson's initials. A note in the margin read, "Meet J. Carter, Red Lion, 8th, the village pub," she recalled, where Grayson had argued with the stranger. The ledger confirmed her theory. Grayson was juggling debts, blackmailing Lydia to cover his own dealings, until she snapped. In St. Mary Mead, a ledger had unmasked a swindler, and this one sealed Grayson's role. At dinner, the household was quieter, but a warmth had returned. Beatrice spoke of plans to restore the gardens, Charles of settling the estate. finances, and Eleanor of studying to help manage the manor. Miss Marple listened, her heart light, seeing a family healing as she had in St. Mary Mead after a crisis. She shared her findings with Craddock later, in a quiet moment by the terrace. The stranger was likely a creditor, she said, her voice low. Grayson's greed led to his death, and Lydia's fear sealed it. Craddock nodded, his notebook closed. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, a rare smile breaking through. The next morning, Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her knitting bag ready for the journey back to St. Mary Mead. Beatrice walked her to the car, her eyes bright with gratitude. "You've given us a future, Jane," she said, her hand warm in Miss Marple's. "Eleanor is my daughter, openly now, and Charles will be stronger for it." Miss Marple smiled, her heart full. "People hide, Beatrice, but truth finds a way," she said, echoing a St. Mary Mead lesson as Mr. Dobbs drove her to the station. The manor faded into the green hills, its shadows gone. Miss Marple opened her notebook, adding a final entry. London's stranger creditor, Grayson's scheme, Annie's note clarified. Will restored, family healed. Lydia justice served. She closed it, her needles clicking softly, the pink scarf finished. Harrow Manor was at peace, and Miss Marple was ready for home, where new puzzles might await. Chapter 16. A shadow from the past. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over Harrow Manor, its golden light softening the stone walls and brightening the gardens where roses bloomed despite the recent horrors. Miss Jane Marple stood in the entrance hall, her suitcase packed and her knitting bag slung over her arm, the pink scarf now complete and tucked inside. The resolution of Mr. Grayson's murder, with Lydia's arrest for the crime driven by fear of losing the estate to Eleanor's inheritance, had brought a fragile peace to the household. The missing will, recovered from a desk drawer, had confirmed Beatrice's intention to split the estate between Charles and Eleanor, her newly acknowledged daughter. Miss Marple's notebook, hidden in her knitting bag, held the clues that had unravelled the case, the red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note, the anonymous warning from Annie, Charles and Lydia's argument, Eleanor's secret parentage, the cigarette case, the orchard meeting letter, the key in Grayson's pocket, the torn will letter, the singed debt papers, the attic fire, the poison vial, and the village gossip about a London stranger. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had closed cases, but as Miss Marple prepared to leave, a new shadow emerged. Pulling her back into the manor's secrets, Beatrice Harrow, her emerald brooch glinting, escorted Miss Marple to the door, her face warm with gratitude. "Jane, you've saved us," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "Eleanor and Charles are united, and the manor feels like home again." Charles, his tie neat, nodded, his eyes softer than before. Eleanor, standing close to Beatrice, offered a shy smile, her newfound confidence evident. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, watched from the hall, her sharp eyes softened with respect, while Annie, the maid, clutched her apron, her face bright with admiration. Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by their gratitude, but her sharp blue eyes caught a flicker of unease in Beatrice's glance toward the chapel. A small stone building visible through the window. "I'm glad to have helped," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "but I'd love a last look at your chapel, Beatrice. It's such a charming place." Beatrice hesitated, her hand touching her brooch, but she nodded. "Of course, Jane," she said, leading the way across the lawn. Miss Marple followed, her sensible shoes crunching on gravel, her mind alert. In St. Mary Mead, a church visit had once revealed a hidden letter, and she sensed the chapel held a clue to the manor's lingering secrets. The chapel was small, its stained glass windows casting colourful patterns on the stone floor. The air was cool, smelling of old wood and wax, and a single pew faced a modest altar. Miss Marple sat, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes scanning the room. She noticed a loose floorboard near the altar, slightly raised, as if recently disturbed. In St. Mary Mead, a loose board had hidden a thief's stash, and she knelt, her fingers probing gently. The board lifted, revealing a small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed with age, its ink faded but legible. It was addressed to Sir Reginald Harrow, Beatrice's late husband, and dated 20 years prior. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, her heart quickening. The letter, in a hurried script, read, "Reginald, you can't hide what happened in Shanghai. The jade statuette is proof. Pay, or I'll tell the village." No signature, but the tone was sharp, threatening, like the blackmail note found in the library. She recalled the shattered statuette, its dragon carvings linking to Grayson's murder weapon. In St. Mary Mead, an old letter had exposed a fraud, and this one hinted at a past crime tied to Sir Reginald, perhaps the root of the Manors. Troubles. She tucked the letter into her knitting bag, her mind racing. Beatrice, standing by the door, noticed her movement and paled. "What's that, Jane?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple rose, her face calm but her eyes piercing. "An old letter, Beatrice, from someone who knew your husband. It mentions Shanghai and the statuette. Do you know anything about it?" Beatrice's hand gripped her brooch, her eyes dropping. "Reginald, he travelled to China years ago," she said softly. "He brought back the statuette, but he never spoke of trouble. I thought it was just a treasure." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw fear, like a St. Mary Mead widow hiding a husband's shame. Miss Marple returned to the manor, the letter heavy in her thoughts. The household was preparing for lunch, and she joined them, her eyes noting their behaviours. Charles ate quietly, his newfound resolve evident. Eleanor helped Beatrice with the plates, their bond growing. Mrs. Poole supervised Annie, who smiled shyly at Miss Marple. But the letter nagged at her Shanghai, the statuette, a past crime. Had Grayson known, using it to blackmail Lydia or others? In St. Mary Mead, an old secret had sparked a modern crime, and she suspected the same here. After lunch, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Tate, the gardener, in the rose garden where Grayson's body had been found. "Mr. Tate," she said, her voice kind, "did Sir Reginald ever mention Shanghai?" The old man leaned on his spade, his eyes narrowing. "Miss, he talked of it once, years back. Said the statuette was a gift, but he looked troubled, like he'd rather forget it." He paused, glancing at the manor. "Mr. Grayson asked about it, too, a month ago. Seemed mighty curious." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the pieces. Grayson's curiosity, the letter's threat, the statuette's destruction all pointed to a secret Reginald had buried, which Grayson had unearthed. She returned to the drawing room, where Beatrice was alone, arranging flowers. "Beatrice," Miss Marple said gently, "this letter suggests Reginald was blackmailed over something in Shanghai. Grayson may have found out, using it against Lydia or others. Did he ever hint at it?" Beatrice's hands shook, a rose falling to the floor. "Grayson, He asked about Reginald's travels, said he'd found papers in the study. I thought it was nothing, but perhaps he knew. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw guilt. Like a St. Mary Mead woman hiding a family scandal, Miss Marple shared the letter with Inspector Craddock, who arrived that afternoon. "This explains Grayson's schemes," he said, his notebook open. He was digging into Reginald's past, maybe to extort more than just Lydia. "We'll investigate Shanghai, there may be records." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the red clay, the statuette, the blackmail. In St. Mary Mead, a past crime had solved a present one, and this letter closed the circle. As she packed her suitcase, Beatrice joined her, her face lighter. "Jane, you've uncovered more than I expected," she said. "Reginald's secret hits, painful, but the truth heals." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag ready. "Truth always finds a way," she said, echoing a St. Mary Mead lesson. Mr. Dobbs drove her to the station, the Manor fading into the hills. Her notebook held a final entry: Shanghai letter Reginald's, secret Grayson's, blackmail, family healed, Manor free. The mystery was solved, and Miss Marple was ready for home, her needles clicking softly, waiting for the next puzzle. Chapter 17. The hidden compartment. The train rattled along the tracks toward Ashford Vale, its rhythmic clatter a steady backdrop to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts as she sat in her compartment, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. The pink scarf, completed during her last visit to Harrow Manor, was tucked away, replaced by a new project, pale blue shawl, its stitches as orderly as her mind. Just days ago, she had left the Manor, believing the mystery of Mr. Grant's murder solved with Lydia's arrest for the crime, driven by fear of losing the estate to Eleanor's inheritance and Grayson's blackmail over Charles's debts. The missing will, recovered from a desk drawer, had restored peace, and the discovery of an old letter in the chapel hinting at Sir Reginald Harrow's past in Shanghai had seemed a final note. But an urgent telegram from Lady Beatrice Harrow, received that morning in St. Mary Mead, had pulled her back. "Jane, please return. New trouble tied to Reginald's letter. Need your help." Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes gazed out the window, her mind on the clues from her notebook, the red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden, the blackmail note, the anonymous warning from Annie, Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter, the cigarette case, the orchard meeting letter, the key in Grayson's pocket, the torn will letter, the singed debt papers, the attic fire, the poisoned vial, the London stranger, and the Shanghai letter. In St. Mary Mead, a second crime often followed the first, and she sensed Harrow Manor's shadows were not yet gone. The Manor loomed against the evening sky as Mr. Dobbs, the driver, met her at the station, his face grim. "It's good you're back, miss," he said, his voice low. "Lady Harrow's in a state." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag at her side, her heart quickening. The Manor's stone walls, softened by ivy, looked as imposing as before, but the air held a new tension, like a St. Mary Mead house after a scandal's echo. Beatrice greeted her at the door, her emerald brooch glinting but her face pale. "Jane, thank heavens," she said, her hands trembling. "Another letter came, like the one you found, threatening to expose Reginald's past. It was left in the chapel, and I'm frightened." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw fear, like a St. Mary Mead widow facing a new threat. The household gathered in the drawing room, their faces marked by unease. Charles, his tie neat but his jaw tight, stood by the window, his newfound resolve strained. Eleanor, close to Beatrice, clutched her hand, her brown eyes wide with worry. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her sharp eyes darting, while Annie, the maid, hovered, her apron still but her face anxious. Miss Marple sat, her knitting resuming its rhythm, her eyes noting their behaviours, Beatrice's fear, Charles's tension, Eleanor's concern, Mrs. Poole's watchfulness, Annie's nerves like a St. Mary Mead tea party before a storm. Beatrice handed Miss Marple the new letter, its paper fresh but its tone chillingly familiar. The Shanghai Secret Lives. Pay, or the village knows. No signature, but the handwriting matched the chapel letter, and it mentioned a sum to be left in the quarry by midnight. Miss Marple's heart quickened. In St. Mary Mead, a second blackmail letter had led to an accomplice, and she suspected Grayson had not worked alone. "Who found it?" she asked, her voice gentle. Beatrice pointed to Annie, who blushed. "I was cleaning the chapel," Miss Annie said. "It was under the pew, tucked in a crack." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Annie's earlier note, "Be careful, Miss Marple," and wondered if the maid knew more. Miss Marple suggested a visit to the chapel, and Beatrice led the way, the household trailing. The small stone building was dim, its stained glass windows casting faint colours on the floor. Miss Marple knelt by the pew, her fingers tracing the crack where Annie had found the letter. She noticed a faint scratch on the wood, like those on the study safe, and pressed gently. A small panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment containing a bundle of paper letters, receipts, and a photograph of Sir Reginald in Shanghai, standing with a man whose face was vaguely familiar. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden cash had exposed a fraud, and this compartment suggested a deeper secret. The photograph showed Reginald beside a man with sharp features, dressed in a suit, holding the jade statuette. A note on the back read, "Shanghai, 1905, R. Harrow and J. Carter." Miss Marple's mind raced J. Carter, the name from Grayson's ledger, linked to the London stranger at the Red Lion. The receipts detailed payments from Reginald to Carter, marked silence. She recalled the village gossip about Grayson's argument with a stranger, and the ledger's note about a meeting with J. Carter. Grayson, she thought, had uncovered Reginald's secret deal gone wrong in Shanghai. Perhaps theft or worse, and used it to blackmail Lydia. But Carter, his accomplice, was now continuing the scheme. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple shared her findings with Inspector Craddock, summoned urgently from the village. Grayson had a partner, she said, her voice calm but firm. J. Carter, from Shanghai, now in London. He's behind this new letter, picking up where Grayson left off. Craddock's eyes narrowed, his notebook open. "We'll trace him," he said. "The London postmark matches the earlier letter." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the red clay, the statuette, the blackmail. In St. Mary Mead, an accomplice had been caught by a trap, and she proposed one now. "We'll place a decoy payment in the quarry," she said, "and watch who comes." Craddock agreed, and that night, under moonlight, they set the trap, a bag of fake money hidden in the quarry's weeds. Miss Marple stayed in the shadows with Craddock, her shawl tight against the chill, her eyes sharp. At midnight, a figure approached, a tall man, his face matching the photograph's J. Carter. He grabbed the bag, but Craddock's men pounced, binding his wrists. "I only wanted what's owed," Carter shouted, his voice desperate. "Reginald cheated me in Shanghai, and Grayson promised to share." Carter's confession came swiftly under Craddock's questioning. He admitted to meeting Grayson in the village, arguing when Grayson refused to split the blackmail money. Carter had written the new letter, hoping to extort Beatrice alone. Miss Marple listened, her heart steady, seeing the final piece fall into place, as it had in St. Mary Mead when a swindler's partner was caught at dawn. Beatrice thanked Miss Marple, her face lighter. "You've saved us again, Jane," she said, her hand on Eleanor's. Charles nodded, his resolve firm, and Eleanor smiled, her place secure. Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her notebook updated. J. Carter accomplice, Shanghai secret, trap successful. Family safe. As Mr. Dobbs drove her to the station, the manor faded, its shadows gone. Her needles clicked, the blue shawl growing, ready for St. Mary Mead's next puzzle. Chapter 18. The forged canvas. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Harrow Manor, casting a soft glow across the polished floors and heavy tapestries, but the warmth did little to ease the renewed tension gripping the household. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a pale blue shawl taking shape in her lap. She had returned to St. Mary Mead just a week ago, believing the mysteries of Harrow Manor resolved. Mr. Grayson's murder. By Lydia, driven by fear of losing the estate to Eleanor's inheritance. The recovery of the missing will, the attic fire hiding Charles's debts, and the capture of J. Carter, Grayson's accomplice in a blackmail scheme tied to Sir Reginald Harrow's Shanghai past. Her notebook, tucked in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues, the red clay linking the library, orchard, quarry, and rose garden. The blackmail note, Annie's anonymous warning, Eleanor's secret as Beatrice's daughter, the cigarette case, the orchard meeting letter, the key in Grayson's pocket, the torn will letter, the singed debt papers, the attic fire, the poison vial, the London stranger, and the Shanghai letter found in the chapel's hidden compartment. But a second urgent telegram from Lady Beatrice, Harrow received that morning, had brought her back. Jane, another crisis. A forged painting threatens ruin. Please come. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes studied the room, sensing a new shadow in the manor, like a St. Mary Mead case where one crime led to another. Beatrice greeted her at the door, her emerald brooch glinting but her face pale with worry. "Jane, you're a godsend," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought it was over, but now this painting it could destroy our reputation." Charles, his tie slightly askew, stood beside her, his jaw tight. Eleanor, her newfound confidence, wavering, clutched Beatrice's arm, her brown eyes anxious. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, watched from the hall, her sharp eyes unreadable, while Annie, the maid, hovered nearby, her apron twisting in her hands. Miss Marple smiled, her heart steady but her mind alert, knowing from St. Mary Mead that a fresh crisis often revealed hidden truths. The household gathered in the manor's gallery, a long room lined with portraits and landscapes, where Beatrice pointed to a painting of a stormy sea, attributed to a renowned artist and a Harrow family treasure. "An appraiser came yesterday," Beatrice explained, her hands shaking. "He says it's a forgery, painted recently but aged to deceive. If word gets out, our finances already strained will collapse." Charles muttered, "It's a scandal." "We can't afford," his voice rough. Eleanor stayed silent, her eyes on the painting, while Mrs. Poole's lips tightened and Annie's hands trembled. Miss Marple's heart, quick in forgery, she thought, was no accident, like a St. Mary Mead case where a fake heirloom hid a theft. She examined the painting, noting its flawless frame but a faint chemical smell, suggesting recent work. Who had access to the gallery? she asked, her voice gentle. Beatrice hesitated. Grayson managed our art collection, but he's gone. The staff, of course, and we all pass through here. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on Grayson's schemes. The Shanghai letter, mentioning the jade statuette, hinted at Reginald's shady dealings. Could the forgery be linked? In St. Mary Mead, a fake painting had covered a smuggler's tracks, and she suspected a similar motive here. Miss Marple suggested checking Grayson's old office, a small room off the study. Beatrice led the way, and they found a locked drawer, opened with the same key from Grayson's pocket that had revealed the will. Inside was a ledger, separate from the one Miss Marple had found, detailing payments to an art dealer in London, marked restoration. A note in Grayson's hand read, "Replace sea painting, Carter to arrange." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Carter, the Shanghai accomplice, was involved. In St. Mary Mead, a ledger had exposed a fraud, and this one pointed to a scheme Grayson had started, perhaps continued by another after his death. She shared the ledger with Inspector Craddock, summoned from the village, his face grim as he read. "Carter's in custody," he said, "but this suggests someone else knew, maybe, someone in the manor." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the household. Charles's debts made him desperate, but his recent honesty suggested innocence. Eleanor's fear seemed tied to her new role, not guilt. Mrs. Poole's watchfulness hinted at knowledge, and Anna's nerves suggested she'd seen something. In St. Mary Mead, a servant's slip had solved a case, and Miss Marple decided to question Annie in the kitchen. Annie polished silver, her hands shaking. "Annie," Miss Marple said softly, "did you see anyone in the gallery, perhaps at night?" Annie flushed, her eyes wide. I saw Mrs. Poole, miss, a week ago, carrying a package to the gallery. I thought it was cleaning supplies, but it was heavy, like a frame." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Mrs. Poole, so loyal, might have been Grayson's pawn. In St. Mary Mead, a housekeeper's secret had unravelled a theft, and she suspected. Mrs. Poole knew more. At dinner, the household was tense, the forgery weighing heavily. Charles ate little, his eyes on Beatrice. Eleanor spoke softly of the gardens, her voice steadying, and Beatrice smiled. Their bond strong. Mrs. Poole served with her usual precision, but Miss Marple caught her glancing at the door, as if expecting trouble. After dinner, Miss Marple confronted Mrs. Poole in the hall. "Mrs. Poole," she said, her voice kind but firm, "you carried a package to the gallery. Was it the forged painting for Grayson?" Mrs. Poole stiffened, her eyes cold. "I don't know what you mean, miss," she said, but her voice wavered, and Miss Marple saw guilt like a St. Mary Mead servant caught in a lie. Miss Marple devised a plan with Craddock, announce a second appraiser's visit to pressure the culprit. At breakfast, Craddock declared, "An expert arrives tomorrow to trace the forgery's source. They'll find fingerprints." Mrs. Poole dropped a tray, her face pale, and Miss Marple knew the trap had worked. Later, Mrs. Poole confessed to Craddock, her voice low. "Grayson paid me to swap the painting," she said. "He said it was to settle debts, and I needed the money for my sister's care. I didn't know it was tied to murder." Nodded, his face stern but kind, and took her statement. Sparing her arrest for her honesty, the household gathered in the drawing room. Beatrice's face relieved as Mrs. Poole apologized, tears in her eyes. Charles vowed to replace the painting, and Eleanor offered to help, their unity stronger. Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her notebook updated, forged painting Grayson's scheme, Mrs. Poole's role, trap successful, family united, as Mr. Dobbs drove her to the station. The manor faded, its shadows lifted. Her needles clicked, the blue shawl growing, ready for St. Mary Mead's next mystery. Chapter 19. The final thread unravelled. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory of Harrow Manor, her knitting needles clicking softly in the late afternoon light. The events of the past days had left the household subdued with Lydia's arrest, casting a sombre pall over the grand estate. Yet Miss Marple's keen eyes, sharp as ever, darted from the delicate lace pattern in her lap to the figures moving about the manor. There was something unfinished, a loose thread in the tapestry, of motives and secrets that had unravelled thus far. The revelations about Grayson's blackmail, Eleanor's parentage, and Lydia's desperate act of murder had tied up much of the mystery. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, told her there was one final piece to uncover. The conservatory was a haven of green, with potted ferns and climbing ivy softening the stark lines of the glass walls. Beatrice sat across from Miss Marple, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mask of weary relief. Charles paced near the window, his usual bluster replaced by a brooding silence, while Eleanor, now openly acknowledged as Beatrice's daughter, sat quietly, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Inspector Craddock had left earlier that morning, satisfied that Lydia's confession and the recovered will had closed the case. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her tea, felt a nagging unease, like a stitch dropped in her knitting that would unravel the entire piece if not addressed. "Jane," Beatrice said, breaking the silence, "you've done us a great service. I don't know how we'd have managed without you, but surely it's over now. Lydia's actions, terrible as they were, have been exposed, and the will is safe." Miss Marple set her knitting down and adjusted her shawl. "My dear Beatrice," she said gently, "you've been through a great deal, and I'm glad justice has been served. But I've been thinking about something, a small detail, really, but it troubles me. You see, in my village, St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who hid a secret not out of malice, but out of fear. It was a small thing, a letter misplaced, but it led to a chain of events that nearly destroyed a family. I can't help but wonder if there's something here we've overlooked." Charles stopped pacing and turned sharply. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple? Lydia killed Grayson. She set the fire. She even tried to poison Eleanor. What more could there be?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with that quiet wisdom that so often disarmed her skeptics. "Oh, Charles, you're quite right that Lydia's actions were the heart of this tragedy. But I've been thinking about the shadows in this house, the ones that linger even after the truth is out. You see, Grayson's blackmail wasn't a solitary act. Blackmailers rarely work alone, not when there's so much to gain. And then there's the matter of the forged canvas you mentioned, Eleanor, in the attic. It's been on my mind." Eleanor looked up, startled. The canvas? But that was just an old painting, wasn't it? Part of the records that burned. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but I've been wondering about that painting. You said it was a portrait of your great-uncle, Beatrice's father, but it was damaged in the fire. Yet, when we examined the attic after the blaze, I noticed something curious. The frame was intact, but the canvas itself was slashed, not burned. That's not the work of fire, my dear. That's deliberate." Beatrice frowned, her fingers tightening. Slashed. But why would anyone destroy an old portrait? It wasn't valuable, not like the jade statuette. "Exactly," Miss Marple said, leaning forward. In St. Mary Mead, I once came across a case where a painting hid something far more valuable than itself, a document tucked behind the canvas. I wonder if we might take a look at that frame, if it's still in the attic. It might tell us something. Charles scoffed, but Eleanor stood, her expression curious. It's worth a try, isn't it? If there's something else to this, we should know. The group made their way to the attic, where the air still carried the acrid scent of smoke. The fire had been contained, but the damage was evident. Boxes, singed papers, and the remnants of old furniture littered the space. Miss Marple, with surprising agility for her age, navigated the debris to where the portrait's frame lay against a wall. It was a heavy oak frame, its gilt edges tarnished but intact. The canvas within was indeed slashed, the portrait of Beatrice's father reduced to ribbons. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the frame's inner edge, her movements deliberate. "Now, let's see," she murmured. With a gentle tug, she pried loose a section of the backing, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed but intact. Beatrice gasped. "What is that?" Miss Marple opened the notebook carefully, her eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. "It appears to be a ledger," she said. "Dates, amounts, names. Oh my, this is quite interesting. It seems your father, Beatrice, was involved in some rather unorthodox financial dealings. Loans, it appears, to some rather unsavory characters in London. And look, here Grayson's name appears, as does another. A Mr. Victor Langston." "Langston," Charles said, his voice sharp. "I've never heard of him." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Haven't you? That's curious, because the village postmistress mentioned a letter addressed to Grayson with a London postmark. I took the liberty of inquiring further yesterday, and she recalled the sender's name, V. Langston. I suspect this ledger was what Grayson was truly after, not just the will. It documents debts that could ruin reputations, even now, years later." Eleanor's face paled. "You think Grayson was working with this Langston? That he was killed over this ledger?" "Not quite," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "I think Grayson was killed to protect the ledger, but not by Lydia, you see. Lydia's motive was the will and her fear of losing the inheritance. But this ledger suggests a larger scheme, one that Grayson stumbled upon and tried to exploit. Someone else in this house knew about it and wanted it kept hidden." Beatrice's hands trembled. "But who, Jane? Who else could have known?" Miss Marple closed the ledger and tucked it under her arm. "Let's return to the conservatory. I think it's time we had a little chat with Mrs. Poole." The housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, was summoned to the conservatory, her nervous demeanour more pronounced than ever. Her hands twisted in her apron as she stood before Miss Marple, who regarded her with a gentle but piercing gaze. "Mrs. Poole," Miss Marple began, "you've been with the Harrow family for many years, haven't you? Long enough to know the secrets of this house, I imagine. I couldn't help but notice, when we found Mr. Grayson's body, that you were the first to arrive. At the rose garden. And yet, you said you were in the kitchen, which is quite a distance away. How did you know to go there so quickly?" Mrs. Poole's eyes darted to the floor. I heard a noise, ma'am. I thought something was wrong. Did you?" Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a housekeeper who overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to. She kept it to herself, out of loyalty, but it ate at her until she couldn't bear it. I wonder, Mrs. Poole, if you overheard something about this ledger, perhaps a conversation between Grayson and someone else. someone who knew its value. Mrs. Poole's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. "I didn't mean no harm," she whispered. "I've served Lady Beatrice all my life, but I heard Mr. Grayson talking to that man, Langston, in the library one night. They were arguing about money owed from years ago, from Sir Harrow's dealings. Grayson said he'd found something in the attic, something that could make him rich. One told Charles. Charles's head snapped up. You told me nothing." "Oh, but she did," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not directly, perhaps, but I suspect Mrs. Poole mentioned something to you, Charles, about Grayson's late-night meetings. You were already under pressure from your debts, weren't you? And when Grayson began blackmailing you, threatening to expose not just your financial troubles, but this ledger, which could tarnish the Harrow name forever, you panicked. You didn't kill Grayson, that was Lydia's doing, but you knew about the ledger, and you helped conceal it. That's why you were so quick to dismiss the slashed canvas as unimportant." Charles's face flushed, but he said nothing, his jaw tight. Miss Marple turned to Beatrice. "My dear, your son has been protecting you, in his way. The ledger could have ruined your family's reputation, and Charles, for all his faults, didn't want that. But Mrs. Poole's loyalty went further. I believe she slashed the canvas after the fire to ensure the ledger stayed hidden. Isn't that right, Mrs. Poole?" The housekeeper sobbed, nodding. "I couldn't let the family be shamed. Sir Harrow was a good man, but he made mistakes. I thought if the ledger was gone, it would all be over." Miss Marple sighed. "It's never so simple, is it? Secrets have a way of resurfacing, like weeds in a garden. But you've done no real harm, Mrs. Poole. The ledger is safe now, and I think Inspector Craddock will understand your motives, though he'll want to know about Mr. Langston." Beatrice reached for Eleanor's hand, her voice steady. "Jane, what do we do now?" Miss Marple smiled. "You do what families do, my dear. You face the truth, however painful, and you rebuild. The ledger will need to be turned over to the authorities, but I suspect Mr. Langston's dealings are long past, and the Harrow name will survive. As for you, Charles, I hope you'll learn from this. Greed and fear make poor companions." The conservatory fell silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves outside. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "Now," she said brightly, "I think it's time for another cup of tea, don't you?" As the household dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her mind already turning to the next small detail, the next quiet observation. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that no mystery was ever truly complete. There was always another thread to unravel, another secret to uncover. But for now, Harrow Manor was at peace, and Miss Marple was content to let the shadows rest. The next morning, she packed her small suitcase, bid farewell to Beatrice and Eleanor, and boarded the train back to St. Mary Mead. As the countryside rolled by, she thought of the ledger, the slashed canvas, and the weight of secrets carried through generations. People are much the same everywhere, she murmured to herself, her eyes twinkling. And thank goodness for that, or I'd have nothing to occupy my time. With a final click of her knitting needles, Miss Marple settled back, ready for whatever mystery awaited her at home. Chapter 20. The Quiet Resolution. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room of Harrow Manor, her knitting needles clicking softly in the early morning light. The events of the past days had left the household subdued, and the once dense air now carried a fragile calm. Lydia's arrest had unravelled the tightly wound secrets of the manor, but Miss Marple sensed that a few threads remained loose, waiting to be gently tugged into place. Her sharp eyes, framed by her delicate spectacles, scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in the demeanor of those around her. The case was solved, yet something lingered, an echo of human frailty that demanded closure. The previous chapters had seen the Manor's secrets laid bare, the revelation of Eleanor's true parentage, the forged canvas discovered in Chapter 18 hinting at Charles's attempt to sell a fake painting to cover his debts, and the hidden compartment in Chapter 17 containing letters that exposed blackmail scheme had all painted a vivid picture of greed and desperation. Chapter 16's shadow from the past long forgotten. Scandal involving Beatrice's late husband and a rival family had added depth to the motives swirling around the estate. And in Chapter 15, the shadows had begun to lift as Beatrice, shaken but resolute, vowed to protect her family's legacy despite its fractured history. Now, as the household prepared to move forward, Miss Marple knew her work was not quite done. There was no more danger, no hidden murderer lurking in the corridors, but there were hearts to mend and truths to settle. She had requested one final gathering in the drawing room, not for a dramatic unmasking, but for something quieter resolution that would allow Harrow Manor to breathe again. The drawing room was bathed in the soft glow of a late autumn sun, its rays filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. Beatrice sat in her usual armchair, her face lined with fatigue but softened by a newfound determination. Eleanor, now openly acknowledged as her daughter, sat close by, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charles, his arrogance dimmed by the weight of recent events, stood by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Inspector Craddock, ever the professional, stood near the door, his notebook tucked away, a faint smile playing on his lips as he watched Miss Marple orchestrate the scene with her characteristic, understated grace. Mrs. Poole bustled in with a tray of tea, her nervous energy replaced by a quiet efficiency. The housekeeper had been shaken by the murder and the fire, but Miss Marple had noted her resilience, a quality she admired, reminiscent of the stalwart women of St. Mary Mead. As Mrs. Poole poured the tea, Miss Marple cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. "My dear friends," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "we have endured a trying time at Harrow Manor. Secrets have been uncovered, and justice has been served. But I believe there is one final matter to address before we can all move forward." Beatrice looked up, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Jane, you've already done so much. What more could there be?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "Not a mystery, Beatrice, but a matter of the heart. You see, in my experience, a house like this, family like yours, cannot heal until all its wounds are acknowledged. There are things left unsaid, and I believe today is the day to say them." Charles shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the mantelpiece. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple? Lydia's gone, the will's been found, and the estate's settled. Isn't that enough?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a knowing glint. "Enough for the law, perhaps, but not for a family. Charles, you've carried a burden of expectation, haven't you? The weight of being the heir, the son who must uphold the Harrow name. But that weight has led you to mistakes, gambling, the forged canvas, even your silence when Grayson pressed you." Charles's face reddened, but he didn't interrupt. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression a mix of sympathy and wariness. "And you, Eleanor," Miss Marple continued, turning to the young woman, "you've lived in the shadow of a secret, fearing it would define you. Yet your loyalty to your mother, your true mother, has been unwavering. That strength is something to be proud of. Eleanor's eyes glistened, and Beatrice reached out to take her hand, a gesture that spoke volumes in its simplicity. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence settle. Beatrice, you've guarded this family's honor with fierce devotion, but at a cost. The fear of scandal, of losing control, has kept you from trusting those closest to you. And yet, here you are, surrounded by those who love you, flawed though they may be. Beatrice's lips trembled, but she nodded. You're right, Jane. I've been so afraid of losing what we've built that I forgot what truly matters. Miss Marple set her cup down, her movements deliberate. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen families torn apart by secrets, but I've also seen them mend when they choose honesty over pride. Charles, Eleanor, Beatrice, you are a family, not just an estate. The will, the money, the manor, they are important, but they are not the heart of Harrow. You are. Charles cleared his throat, his voice rough. Miss Marple, I've made mistakes. The gambling, the painting, I thought I could fix things without anyone knowing. I was wrong, and Eleanor. He turned to his sister, his expression softening. I've been a fool. You're my sister, not just some distant relation. I should have treated you better. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she managed a small smile. Charles, I never wanted to take anything from you. I just wanted to belong. Beatrice's voice was steady but thick with emotion. You both belong. I should have said it sooner, made it clear. Eleanor, you're my daughter, and Charles, you're my son. The will was never meant to divide. You, it was meant to protect. You both. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. There, you see. The truth has a way of setting things right. But there's one more thing. She reached into her handbag and produced a small, folded piece of paper. This was found in the hidden compartment tucked among Grayson's letters. It's not evidence, but a letter from your late father, Beatrice, addressed to you. Beatrice took the paper with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes scanned the words, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. He knew about Eleanor. He wrote that he loved us both, no matter the circumstances. He wanted us to be a family. Chapter 20. The Quiet Resolution. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room of Harrow Manor, her knitting needles clicking softly in the early morning light. The events of the past days had left the household subdued, and the once dense air now carried a fragile calm. Lydia's arrest had unravelled the tightly wound secrets of the manor, but Miss Marple sensed that a few threads remained loose, waiting to be gently tugged into place. Her sharp eyes, framed by her delicate spectacles, scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in the demeanour of those around her. The case was solved, yet something lingered, an echo of human frailty that demanded closure. The previous chapters had seen the manor's secrets laid bare. The revelation of Eleanor's true parentage, the forged canvas discovered in Chapter 18, hinting at Charles's attempt to sell a fake painting to cover his debts, and the hidden compartment in Chapter 17, containing letters that exposed blackmail scheme, had all painted a vivid picture of greed and desperation. Chapter 16's shadow from the past, long forgotten. Scandal involving Beatrice's late husband and a rival family had added depth to the motives swirling around. The estate, and in Chapter 15, the shadows had begun to lift as Beatrice, shaken but resolute, vowed to protect her family's legacy despite its fractured history. Now, as the household prepared to move forward, Miss Marple knew her work was not quite done. There was no more danger, no hidden murderer lurking in the corridors, but there were hearts to mend and truths to settle. She had requested one final gathering in the drawing room, not for a dramatic unmasking, but for something quieter, resolution that would allow Harrow Manor to breathe again. The drawing room was bathed in the soft glow of a late autumn sun, its rays filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. Beatrice sat in her usual armchair, her face lined with fatigue but softened by a newfound determination. Eleanor, now openly acknowledged as her daughter, sat close by, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charles, his arrogance dimmed by the weight of recent events, stood by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Inspector Craddock, ever the professional, stood near the door, his notebook tucked away, a faint smile playing on his lips as he watched Miss Marple orchestrate the scene with her characteristic understated grace. Mrs. Poole bustled in with a tray of tea, her nervous energy replaced by a quiet efficiency. The housekeeper had been shaken by the murder and the fire, but Miss Marple had noted her resilience, a quality she admired, reminiscent of the stalwart women of St. Mary Mead. As Mrs. Poole poured the tea, Miss Marple cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. "My dear friends," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "we have endured a trying time at Harrow Manor. Secrets have been uncovered, and justice has been served. But I believe there is one final matter to address, before we can all move forward." Beatrice looked up, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Jane, you've already done so much. What more could there be?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "Not a mystery, Beatrice, but a matter of the heart. You see, in my experience, a house like this, family like yours, cannot heal until all its wounds are acknowledged. There are things left unsaid, and I believe today is the day to say them." Charles shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the mantelpiece. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple? Lydia's gone, the will's been found, and the estate's settled. Isn't that enough?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a knowing glint. "Enough for the law, perhaps, but not for a family. Charles, you've carried a burden of expectation, haven't you? The weight of being the heir, the son who must uphold the Harrow name. But that weight has led you to mistakes, gambling the forged canvas, even your silence when Grayson pressed you." Charles's face reddened, but he didn't interrupt. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression a mix of sympathy and wariness. "And you, Eleanor," Miss Marple continued, turning to the young woman, "you've lived in the shadow of a secret, fearing it would define you. Yet your loyalty to your mother, your true mother, has been unwavering. That strength is something to be proud of." Eleanor's eyes glistened, and Beatrice reached out to take her hand, a gesture that spoke volumes in its simplicity. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence settle. "Beatrice, you've guarded this family's honor with fierce devotion, but at a cost. The fear of scandal, of losing control, has kept you from trusting those closest to you. And yet, here you are, surrounded by those who love you, flawed though they may be." Beatrice's lips trembled, but she nodded. "You're right, Jane. I've been so afraid of losing what we've built that I forgot what truly matters." Miss Marple set her cup down, her movements deliberate. "In St. Mary Mead, I've seen families torn apart by secrets, but I've also seen them mend when they choose honesty over pride. Charles, Eleanor, Beatrice, you are a family, not just an estate. The will, the money, the manor, they are important, but they are not the heart of Harrow. You are." Charles cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Miss Marple, I've made mistakes. The gambling, the painting, I thought I could fix things without anyone knowing. I was wrong, and Eleanor. He turned to his sister, his expression softening. I've been a fool. You're my sister, not just some distant relation. I should have treated you better. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she managed a small smile. Charles, I never wanted to take anything from you. I just wanted to belong. Beatrice's voice was steady but thick with emotion. You both belong. I should have said it sooner, made it clear. Eleanor, you're my daughter, and Charles, you're my son. The will was never meant to divide. It was meant to protect you both. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. There you see. The truth has a way of setting things right. But there's one more thing. She reached into her handbag and produced a small, folded piece of paper. This was found in the hidden compartment, tucked among Grayson's letters. It's not evidence, but a letter from your late father, Beatrice, addressed to you. Beatrice took the paper with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes scanned the words, and a Miss Marple's smile was warm. And so you shall be. The past has its shadows, but they need not define your future. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his tone light. Miss Marple, you've done it again. I thought my job was to solve crimes, but you've gone and solved a family. The room shared a quiet laugh, the first genuine moment of levity in days. Mrs. Poole, standing by the door, wiped a tear from her eye, and even the sombre air of Harrow Manor seemed to lift, as if the walls themselves exhaled. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple took a final walk through the rose garden, where Grayson's body had been found. The air was crisp, the scent of earth and fading blooms mingling in the breeze. She paused by the spot where the red clay had provided her crucial clue, her mind drifting to St. Mary Mead, where such small details often unravelled the grandest mysteries. Beatrice joined her, a shawl draped over her shoulders. Jane, I don't know how to thank you. You've given us more than justice. You've given us a chance to start again. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with kindness. My dear Beatrice, it's what I do. People are much the same, whether in a village or a manor. They stumble, they hide, but they also heal. You'll do fine, as long as you talk to one another. Beatrice nodded, her gaze distant but hopeful. Will you stay a little longer? Miss Marple shook her head. I've a train to catch, and my garden in St. Mary Mead is calling. Besides, you don't need me anymore. You've got each other. The train to St. Mary Mead chugged through the countryside, its rhythm soothing Miss Marple's thoughts. She opened her knitting bag, pulling out the soft wool she'd been working Anna's scarf for her nephew, Raymond. As the needles resumed their familiar dance, she reflected on Harrow Manor, its secrets, and its redemption. Greed had driven Lydia to murder, fear had silenced Eleanor, and pride had blinded Charles. But love, quiet, resilient love, had brought them back together. It was a story she'd seen before, in the cottages and lanes of her village, and she knew she'd see it again. Human nature, she mused, was as predictable as it was surprising, and it was in its contradictions that she found her purpose. As the train pulled into the familiar station, Miss Marple gathered her things, her heart light. The manor's shadows had lifted, and she was home, ready for whatever mystery might next find its way to her doorstep. For now, though there was tea to be brewed, a garden to tend, and a scarf to finish, and that, she thought, was quite enough. Gasp escaped her lips. He knew about Eleanor. He wrote that he loved us both, no matter the circumstances. He wanted us to be a family.